Thanks so much for being with us here on Atlanta News First Plus. I'm Joy Libnakrin here with our guest analyst joining us this afternoon. We have local Atlanta-based criminal defense attorney Josh Schiffer. So, of course, we are awaiting the arrival of the former president to that Manhattan courthouse where he is expected to appear for his arraignment. And, you know, we're expecting that he's going to enter a plea of not guilty. Josh, you were just explaining as we were discussing off camera that can be done either through himself or through his attorney because there's no mental competency issues. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that the actual mechanics of this are going to be really smooth. DA Bragg's office has bent over backwards to allow the Trump team to basically run this show as long as the goal of getting him arraigned is accomplished. The actual physical arraignment is almost instantaneous. The judge is going to unseal the indictment, is going to present the charges, then ask for that plea, which is expected to be not guilty on each of the charges. Mr. Trump can actually enter that plea himself, or his lawyer, who is his designated mouthpiece, is specifically allowed to enter that plea of not guilty. And then I imagine the judge is going to want to conclude the hearing as quickly as possible and move this business along.
Yeah, you know, something that we've been discussing is the possibility of a mugshot. So before the arraignment, you know, there has to be the booking. And from what I understand, under New York law, fingerprints are required, but a mugshot is not required. And Trump's attorney really pushed back against having a mugshot, given the, you know, campaign for re-election in 2024. And it's up to the prosecutor to decide. And the prosecutor, from my understanding, has decided we don't need a mugshot because everybody knows who Donald Trump is. So
Yeah,
we don't need that.
It's a really fascinating hot potato. I've never seen it dealt with quite this way. The fingerprints are important because that's actually tied to your identification through the NCIS and the other state shared identification programs. Each state has basically a criminal record database, and those databases are shared amongst each other, and there are some national databases as well. And your fingerprints are a very important key metric in that. So the fingerprint and having a fingerprintable charge is really a substantial issue. That is official on your records, is going to be searchable. It's how it's going to be tracked. Mugshot, it's not needed. That's solely something that we've done over time that assists the identification of the defendant or of the accused, but it's not actually mandatory. And as I understand, the DA's office and the court have both offered Mr. Trump's team, or President Trump's team, the opportunity to skip the mugshot. And whether that happens or not, or whether President Trump wants to force the issue, that's going to be totally up to that team. I think it's kind of an interesting issue. I could see President Trump leaning into the mugshot. Obviously, it would be an indelibly important image for American culture and history. So we'll see whether that happens or not. That may be discussed in front of the judge, but we really don't know right now.
And we have learned that now President Trump has been booked. Can you explain the terminology with me? We're seeing under arrest as the terminology, booked as the terminology. Can you kind of break that down and the distinctions, if there is one?
Absolutely. And the words matter, but again, it's a bunch of semantics for the process. Booking is the process of answering your charge and being processed by the system more than anything official, such as being arraigned or entering a plea. When you see a term such as arraignment or entry of a plea, that's an official court action that has to happen. It's part of due process to be arraigned. And being arraigned basically means that you were informed in court of what your charge is. And you can either be arraigned by having them read the charges to you on the record, or you can waive arraignment in most places and just accept a copy of the charges. That process is instantaneous. As soon as you have been made aware, you are arraigned. Booking, though, again, is the process of going in and out of the system, being recorded, being placed in the appropriate organizational materials, and having the file created, because there are multiple files that are created with every kind of indictment or accusation. So the booking process, it's a stroke of on a keyboard. Someone in the database has acknowledged that he's been received by the law enforcement agency, and when they have entered him into the system and hit entered, that file now exists within the database. They'll jump through the mechanics here very, very quickly, and then everybody's waiting to see what happens next.
Yeah, he is in police custody. When we're talking about semantics. Sorry, I just want to have a remark, couple words off on this stream, if you don't mind, to let the viewers in. I hope you don't mind. Maria, who's helping me out here. Maria, is this a live? Can you just show me what are we looking at here in Cam 3 on this feed? Okay, so this is right outside the courthouse in Manhattan. Apologize, we're just kind of, I'm controlling the video at the same time that we're having this conversation, so I want to make sure that I'm clear on what we're showing you. So this is outside the courthouse in Manhattan, where the arraignment is expected to take place at 2:15. Mr. Trump facing about 30 or so charges, and again expected to enter a plea of not guilty. Look at those barricades. Clearly, some concerns about security and protests. And I want to show you on camera 4, Maria, if you don't mind. Now, I'm just trying to get an idea of what perspective we're looking at. This shot is breaking up a little bit, but you can certainly see it's a lot of crowds. You get an idea of just how much interest there is in this case. I'm not sure.
All of it is courthouse.
But so just different angles around the courthouse is what we're seeing right now. Let me go back to this camera. But yeah, so I just want to give our viewers just a sense of the energy that is kind of palpable, in New York ahead of all this.
It's absolutely cultural zeitgeist manifesting. We have one of the most important political and cultural personalities in the history of the United States being accused for the very first time as a former president of felony crime. This is earth-shattering. How this goes through and affects our system is unknown, and every gray hair in academia is wondering what are the ramifications of this process. And that's just in the establishment. How the grassroots react to this kind of prosecution is going to inform our politicians moving forward in perpetuity. How we treat the theory of no man is above the law really has hit the ground here. This case, as so many smart pundits have analyzed, this case is real. It is legitimate. There have been allegations and a lot of testimony proffered over whether lies or misrepresentations were made in connection with a campaign and the payment of this money. Let's remember, the actual payment of the money and all, that's all legal. There's no crime in paying someone for silence necessarily. It's the context in which it was done and whether they can proximately connect that to some sort of false statement related to an election. That's the key metric that we're looking at, and that's going to be the heart of the defense, because this does appear very straightforward to be somewhat politically motivated, if not entirely politically motivated, and that includes even the charging decision to break out what could have been a small 2 or 3 or 4 count case into something that is now 30 plus charges. And looking at those charges, seeing the charging decision that DA Bragg has made, that's what all the lawyers in the room are looking for, because that's going to tell us how hard this is to defend or whether the state's going to bring a strong case.
Right, and so that's really why, well, partly why there's so much attention being paid to this arraignment, because of course the indictments are under seal, and we won't know the specific charges until the actual arraignment. Right, this is the process. This is the time when the defendant actually is faced with the charges against them, presented with the charges against them, and then answers the charges. But like you said, Josh, we are anticipating some 30 charges, really centered on falsifying business records, because as you said, paying hush money is not illegal in New York. It's not. And so this was what many would call a creative prosecution that they saw, and I don't want to editorialize, but many would argue that this was, Alvin Bragg finding a law to kind of correspond with the wrongdoing that he identified. Do you agree with that?
I absolutely do. And even if you disagree with it, it is absolutely a colorable argument that this is, like you said, a creative prosecution where the state was looking for a pathway, a specific pathway to go after this specific act, when there are millions and millions of crimes that occur that are never prosecuted. The discretion involved with being an elected prosecutor is robust and momentous. There is simply an enormous amount of power to decide where law enforcement points their resources. And there's certainly no lack of crime in a major city. This is the district attorney pulling resources from one sector and applying them in another. And in this case, instead of it being murders, rapes, and hijackings or white collar or something else, this is a political prosecution. DA Bragg's never going to be able to get away from that. It's whether the state can put forth a straight-faced, legitimate prosecution, given the gravity of what's happened, the importance of New York as a venue, and how President Trump's team is going to respond to that. I feel that jurors are going to be open to considering if this is a political only or politically motivated prosecution as part of whether the state is operating in good faith, and whether the state's operating in good faith is always a question during a prosecution.
And Josh, I do want to be careful that we maintain balance here, because of course on one side, certainly Trump himself has called it a witch hunt. His supporters say it is a politically motivated witch hunt. But on the other side, Alvin Bragg, his supporters, many Democrats say this is really about rule of law. It's about showing that no one is above the law, even if you are a former president.
Yep.
So that said, I want to just kind of, because again, I don't want to, appear that we're supporting or opposing one side or the other. When prosecutors make decisions to prosecute, I mean, there is discretion.
Yes.
It's not that prosecutors go after every single crime that is committed every time a law is broken. So those choices have to be made. Can you kind of explain a little bit about that and how that happens?
Yeah, it's the ultimate expression of local control, and those elections that a lot of people say, oh, it doesn't matter to me. What you're doing with your vote is empowering this discretion. You've selected a member of the community to represent the entire community and decide which alleged crimes are going to be prosecuted. The elected prosecutor has basically full discretion to choose how, what, where, why, and when they pursue individual crimes. And that means that they're going to also choose by nature crimes that they're not going to pursue. So they've got to weigh and balance their obligations to their community and their constituency while doing their job. Now, there's a lot of guidance from different organizations. There's state statutory guidance. There are certainly limitations on what a local prosecutor can go after. But choosing whether or not to prosecute, and most importantly, choosing how to prosecute, that is solely and completely in the elected prosecutor's wheelhouse. That's what's been so interesting in the development of this case, because as you point out, no person is above the law. And is this case easy to prosecute? Many people would say yes, because it's not one based on emotions. This is a document charge. When these payments were made, is there a causal connection? Is there a connection that a jury can infer from? And when compared to the indictment that was returned by a grand jury, has a law been shown to be broken? It's not one of those cases where you're begging to believe one person over another. A lot of the evidence is going to be very straightforward.
Josh, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we are receiving a briefing from the White House. Let's go live now to our nation's capital.
To go up, and that did not happen. If anything, in fact, gasoline prices went down by $1.50 when it was at its peak this past summer. A lot of that is because of the actions that this president took. And just to give you a little bit more, the price of oil has been trading around $80 a barrel over the past month. They are around 110 and 120 a barrel last year. And I just mentioned the prices of gas. So again, last year, the analysts predicted prices would go higher. And because of what the president did, because of the policies that he put forward, because of the actions that he put forward, we have seen those prices go down, especially if you think about gas prices. I'm not going to get into hypotheticals about the summer or what the summer is going to bring. But again, that's the main focus for this president is the American people. We'll continue to work with all producers and consumers to ensure energy markets, support economic growth, and lower prices for the American consumer. I'll come to that. Okay.
Thanks, Green. Just in that vein, I mean, the president specifically said, when asked about OPEC Plus, it's not as bad as you think. Can you just clarify specifically what he was saying and why is it not as bad?
I mean, I kind of touched on it already, which is last year analysts were predicting that the prices were going to increase, and it didn't. And a lot of it is because of the actions that this president took. And we see that in the price of oil per a gallon. We see that in the gas prices. And so, that is what the president's going to continue to focus on how do we lower the prices for the American people. That's why the Inflation Reduction Act is so important. When you think about energy security, that's why many of the other, like CHIPS and Science Act, all of the other bipartisan infrastructure legislation, those historic pieces of legislation are so critical and important. So again, analysts were wrong a year ago, and we have the data to prove that.
Is there any thoughts of tapping the strategic petroleum reserves again, or maybe going to Venezuela? I mean, are those Biden in the fall talked about other alternatives? Are those some of the alternatives that they're considering now?
So look, I'm not going to getting into hypotheticals, especially about any market predictions that have proven wrong in the past, as I just mentioned. Look, what we know is what the president has done has worked. I'm just going to leave that there and not get into hypotheticals. Okay.
Karine, has the president been briefed on the security operations underway in New York in advance of the former president's arraignment?
Don't have any preview or conversations to share with all of you. As you know, the president gets the daily presidential briefing every morning, but I just don't have anything specifically on that. All I can say is that the president is that we are prepared, and don't want to get too much into hypotheticals from here. And
in this moment where there are some prominent Republicans talking specifically about whether Americans can trust the justice system here. We've seen President Biden say he does have faith in the legal system, but can you help Americans understand why this isn't a moment for the president to come out and speak more forcefully on the rule of law, or what this could mean more widely?
Look, I'm just not going to speak to this case. I'm not going to go beyond what the president shared with all of you, but I'm just not going to speak to an ongoing case. I'm going to leave it there.
And finally, on my colleagues reporting yesterday on the Chinese spy balloon that was able to get some sensitive information and transmit it back to Beijing in real time. The administration says there's an assessment underway about just what China may have been able to glean. Can you update us at all on the timeline for how much is left in that review and whether there are any plans to brief Congress or the president to speak publicly about that?
So, as you mentioned, there is a review being done by the FBI. I believe my colleague spoke to this yesterday. I'm not going to confirm or address that report, but what I'll say a couple of things from here. Look, we knew the flight path of the balloon before it crossed the United States. That's something that I said from here. We took precautions in advance to ensure that it didn't get sensitive information. It's also something that I said from this podium during that time. When it comes to technology like this balloon, it has limited additive value compared to other means of intelligent collection. So the bottom line, the administration identified this problem and it did something about it. And again, not going to confirm or address it. As you said, there's an ongoing review. Don't have a timeline on that. Good, Andrew.
Thanks. Just to follow up on my colleague, Evan Gershkovich, is the president's planning to speak to his parents?
So I don't have any calls to read out at this time. As I said, this is a priority for this president. As I said to your colleague last week, your colleague Evan is on our minds, and we are certainly thinking about them and about him, about Evan, and so we're doing everything that we can to get a counselor to him, and we'll have more to update and share.
And just on a different subject, China announced on Friday a cybersecurity probe into Micron Technologies, a major U.S. chip maker. Does the U.S. view that as an effort by China to undercut the U.S. chips industry, and they see any evidence of a broader effort by China to do that?
So look, I'm not going to speak directly to China's actions. All I can say is the CHIPS and Science Act, as you know, was a bipartisan piece of legislation that was historic, and it speaks to the president's commitment to bring manufacturers back to the United States, to make sure that we have manufacturing jobs right here. We've created under this president more than 800,000 jobs, and you're seeing companies like Micron take action and continue to invest here in America, and that's what the president is focused on. And the president has said from the beginning of his administration mentioned, we are looking for competition with China, not conflict. And that's what you're seeing in this moment as you're looking again at these manufacturing jobs as these companies are investing right here in the U.S.
Afghanistan, please.
Let me 1 second. Go ahead.
The bill that would allow the U.S. to sue OPEC countries for manipulating energy markets, does the White House have a position on that bill yet? It's known as the NOPEC bill.
The NOPEC bill. What'd you say? What are you whispering?
I'm not whispering.
No whispering allowed. So a couple of things. Look, the president is focused on securing America's energy independence. And so that's the best way to ensure American families aren't subject to the actions of those halfway around the world. And his policies are working. As I just mentioned, oil and gas prices have gone down from last year because of the actions that this president took. U.S. oil production is on track to break a historic record this year, and we are accelerating investments in clean energy through the Inflation Reduction Act. Again, a historic piece of legislation that is going to make a difference when we talk about energy security in this country.
Afghanistan, please.
I'm going to come to you.
Thank you. A U.S. ambassador to India, Eric Gassett, is now headed to New Delhi. What's the presidential message that Ambassador Gassett is carrying with himself for the people of India?
So look, this is something that I've said from here, that the president has said when we look at the relationship with India. It's one of the most consequential relationships that the United States has in the world. That still stands. And Ambassador Garcetti will be leading an ambitious effort to deepen our cooperation with India in critical and emerging technologies, expand our defense cooperation, and strengthen our economic and people-to-people ties. Again, one of the most consequential relationships that we have in the United States in the world. So that the United States have in the world. So it's an important relationship that the president sees.
I have one more. What is the U.S. view on China renaming 11 places in the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh? This is another attempt by the Chinese to claim of us Indian territory.
So look, the United States, as you know, Lila, has recognized that territory for a long time. And we strongly oppose any unilateral attempts to advance territorial claims by renaming localities. And so, again, this is something that we have long stood by. Okay.
A few things. Thanks, Corey. On this meeting regarding AI and other technology issues, has the president himself ever been shown or used these new AI tools?
I'm not going to get ahead of the PCAS meeting. I think you'll see more and hear more from the president, so I'm not going to get ahead of what the president's going to be talking about and announcing.
Afghanistan,
That's a tease. Following up on the Evan Gershkovich case, can you confirm here that the Russian ambassador was summoned to the State Department to discuss this detention?
I don't have anything to confirm from here.
You've covered most everything else I want to ask about, so I want to ask about this. Nicaragua. This week, Daniel Ortega has banned Holy Week street processions due to unspecified security concerns, meaning people in this overwhelmingly Catholic country cannot participate, in essence, profess their faith. Comes a few weeks after Ortega detained a Roman Catholic bishop. I know you were asked, and Kirby was asked about this recently, just wondering if the Biden administration has any response to these?
So a couple of things. Yes, I know that question, I believe, came up last week. Look, there has been a dramatic deterioration of respect for democratic principles and human rights by the Ortega Murillo regime in Nicaragua, including the harassment and imprisonment of democratic leaders, members of the political opposition, faith leaders, students, and journalists as well. The United States finds this unacceptable, condemns these actions, and we have already taken a number of actions, as you know, Ed, to promote accountability for the regime's actions, including by imposing sanctions, and we will continue to do so. And we'll go to the back. Go ahead, Ed.
Yeah, thanks, great. So on the technology event coming up later, so critics are saying the president has been late on TikTok, acting against TikTok. So what's the time frame then for guidelines on artificial intelligence or a pause on more powerful artificial intelligence?
So look, when it comes to TikTok, I want to be very clear. There's a CFIUS review. You've heard us say that over and over again from this podium, and that still stands. And the president has been very, very clear about his concern, his national security concern as it relates to the American people with this app. So just want to be very clear here. And so, look, like I said last time, this question was asked by your colleague here, who was very dramatic about AI.
But not on the time frame.
Well, look, I
get to
don't
it quickly?
look, I
Is it another
don't have
year?
a time frame to share with you. As I mentioned, there's a comprehensive process, mentioned this last week, which is underway to figure out how we're going to have a cohesive federal government approach to this. This is incredibly important. You're going to hear from the president. He's going to speak to this. As you know, as I mentioned, he's going to speak to PCAST, so I'll let him let you hear from him directly. But clearly, this is something that the team is looking at and is very focused on.
Yeah, one more, if I could. House Republicans are meeting with the Taiwan president today. The top lawmakers, though, on the Hill are calling for information or hearings on information related to Chinese-made cranes at U.S. ports. Should there be hearings or an assessment by the NSC about possible spying by the Chinese at U.S. ports through these
Yeah,
cranes?
I think you've asked me this question before. Nothing has changed from what I shared with you the last time. I'm just not going to get into it from here about hearings. Okay, but there's a way to do this, my friend. You know that. Give me a second. Let me get around. Go ahead, Ben.
On Evan Gershkovich's case, how worrying of a sign is it that the U.S. still does not have consular access to him, and what are you doing at a higher level to push for that?
Well, I just laid out the conversations that Secretary Blinken had with his counterpart just over the weekend. We're taking this very seriously. This is a priority for this president. Yes, we are concerned, and we're working diligently, very hard to get a counselor to Evan. That again, this is a priority, and so is Paul Whelan. Want to make sure I lay that out for folks as well. But yes, we are doing, the State Department is doing all that they can to make sure a counselor is available to Evan. As you know, these are challenging circumstances, as you all know, and we are doing, again, everything in our power to get a counselor access to him quickly.
The Journal's lawyers have been trying to visit him in prison. Is the White House in touch with the Journal about this, and how soon do you expect them to visit him?
I don't have anything to read out about a conversation with about the Wall Street Journal. I just don't have anything to read out on that. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Karine. Not asking about Trump, but about the precedent that this opens. Does the White House believe that a former president could or should be indicted?
I'm just not going to comment from here. Okay. All right. Oh, go ahead, Peter.
To follow up on that, President Biden is a lawyer. Is he
And
concerned?
the President of the United States and the Commander-in-Chief, but go ahead.
He is, but as a lawyer, is he concerned at all that a local DA indicting a former president could down the line open up the possibility, set the precedent, that local DAs that don't like former President Biden could indict him?
I'm not going to comment from here.
Why don't you have more to say about the Trump indictment?
It is an ongoing case, and I've been very clear about that. We've been prudent about that, not commenting on ongoing cases, and we're going to stick to that.
But for
Peter?
better or worse, all that anybody in the country is talking about at this exact moment while we are in here is Trump. And they look here to find out what the White House thinks about it. And
Well, I think the American people should feel reassured that when there is an ongoing case like this one, that we're just not commenting.
And so, does the lack of comment mean that you do not think anything happening in New York today is one of the top issues facing the country at the moment?
That's your assessment. That's not my assessment. I'm just laying out the facts that we are just not going to comment on an ongoing case from here. And we've been very consistent. We've been very prudent, and we're going to stick there. Courtney, go ahead.
Thanks, Karine. I wanted to ask you about judges. Senator Hyde-Smith said today that she's not going to return a blue slip for Scott Cullum. He's your nominee for a court in Mississippi. Did you have awareness on that, and are you going to proceed with the nomination?
So this is the first time I'm hearing about this, so I would have to go back to my team before I can comment fully.
And I also wanted to ask you about unwinding the pandemic measures. Can you talk about the the requirement that foreign travelers be vaccinated? Is that something that you're reconsidering, or that people should expect to unwind along with the public health emergency as we head toward May 11th?
So, look, I'll say more broadly the work that this administration has done since day one, since the president walked into this administration on really dealing with COVID-19 and long COVID, and long COVID continues, right? COVID is still with us. We're in a different place than we have been, and that's because of the work that this president has done. And thanks to those actions, we've seen that progress has been made. We're in better positions to transition out of the emergency phase of this response. That is important because of the comprehensive response that we have had, that this president has pushed forward. And when we have more to say, I certainly will share that closer to May. I don't have anything to preview or to announce at this time.
Thank you.
Afghanistan. Afghanistan, please.
Go ahead.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you so much. Are there any circumstances, stepping back from New York, are there any circumstances?
Wow, they are going to arrest me. Can't believe this is happening in America, according to the former president. Also, a source told CBS News that Trump is being charged with falsifying business records in the first degree, a felony. It could be as many as 30 or more counts. The indictment, a first of a current or former president in U.S. history, stems from this 2016 hush money payment to cover up an alleged affair with porn star Stormy Daniels. We should note Trump has denied any wrongdoing. He has vowed to fight these charges. He has been active, sending fundraising pitches this morning, active on his own social media site, denouncing the judge attacking him and his family. We are told that attorneys close to the former president say that he himself will plead not guilty when the charges are read in court. We should note CBS News has reporters inside that courtroom, also just outside that courtroom, so we will be able to give you a first-hand account of exactly what happens. No cameras inside, according to a judge's ruling just late last night. Want to talk about a number of things as we continue to watch this picture very closely, as we are expecting to see the president there. The uncharted political territory that we're in right now, Robert. This is a significant case, certainly the spectacle today that we are watching very closely. But the former president faces legal jeopardy on a number of fronts.
He really does. And this is uncharted political territory, but it's not necessarily uncharted Trump territory. We talk about this unprecedented nature, but it actually has a precedent in Trump's own life. You go back 50 years, 5 decades, the Trump Organization in New York has been under investigation at various times. He has been a creature of New York, of the tabloids, of the business community, of the legal community, a Trump lawyer. I mean, that list is very long about all the people who have been a Trump lawyer over the past 50 years. And there are many lawyers right now working for Trump on that active grand jury investigation of his handling of classified material. And when you talk to Trump confidants, and they're being candid with you, they say the investigation of Trump's possible obstructive acts, about how he handled classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. Did he instruct aides to go dig into the files instead of giving them back to the National Archives? That is the case that has people on the edge of their seat, not what's happening in New York today.
And what about that, the discussion that exists that this wasn't the best first case to bring against the former president?
Well, it may not have been the quote-unquote best first case, but it is in fact the first case. So it's always the prosecutor who can get to the indictment first, as long as they have really done their homework. And we have to remember, it's not just a prosecutor. You have 23 grand jurors who hear evidence, and it is really their decision. It only takes 12 of them, but they decide if there is probable cause to go forward. Perhaps there are people who would have rather seen the Mar-a-Lago document case, the obstruction case, the January 6th case, the Georgia case, but you don't get to do what you'd rather.
And this particular case has been built by prosecutors for years, under multiple district attorneys, with outside prosecutors of great reputation brought in to try and bring this case. And it's only now, after that hush money payment made in 2016, only now, what's in this indictment that we're about to see?
Well, Jeff, I just wanted to add about the fact that this was called the zombie case, that within the office, that it would grow again and then fade again. And so that was its nickname.
Yeah, I think in some ways, I think people might be underestimating this case and underestimating Alvin Bragg, you know, he is someone who grew up in New York, Harlem, went to Harvard. He was elected to this job in 2021, walked in the door in 2022, but he walked into a case that was sort of incomplete. It was somebody else's, another DA's work, essentially. So are you going to put your name on somebody else's case like that? No. So he slowed things down, as you know, and everybody at this table knows, got a lot of criticism here in New York, where really he was given a mandate to go after former President Trump when he was elected. And so
he ran on that.
Exactly. So there were a lot of people in New York who were saying, what are you doing? I thought you were going to bring this case. So he stepped back, brought in some new prosecutors, impaneled this new grand jury, as you know, and I think they've built a case here. You got these 30 counts that are sitting in this indictment. Everybody's wondering what they are. But you don't go after a target like this unless you've really checked your case and your evidence. And I suspect by running it through that grand jury and getting the indictment by impaneling that grand jury, you know, they seem to be confident in the case that they have.
And we talked to him a couple of months ago, and he said, we'll do our talking in the courtroom, which is fascinating because we're going to hear from him today.
This is Alvin Bragg.
This is Alvin Bragg, and we interviewed him a couple months ago, and you know, he was impervious to all of the speculation about what he was up to, and he would barely admit to his own name. But one thing he did say was that there's a lot of things happening behind the scenes, to your point. We're going to learn very shortly whether really there was anything happening behind the scenes. And he kept insisting that we'll do our talking in the courtroom. The challenge today for those of us watching it and analyzing it is what's happening in the world of the courtroom and what's happening in the world of circus. And for Alvin Bragg, his job is to deal with what happens in the world of the courtroom. But the world of circus still exists. And so how he manages both of those things, whether he ignores it entirely, whether he plays with it because it does affect what goes on in the courtroom, that's one of the fascinating things to watch today and going forward.
Yeah, I think people also forget the Cohen case. And I'm sure when you read those documents, when that case came out, we were all looking through that document, and you saw individual A, right? And everybody was like, well, that has to be the president at the time. You know, and I think if you look back to that indictment of Cohen, and you piece that together with what Cohen and Lanny Davis are saying now, hey, one thing that we know is that the president advised, they say, Cohen to lie to Congress. You know, that's one thing that might also be in this indictment.
And that was a federal case. And so the whole question for the district attorney in Manhattan was, do you take a federal case and then apply it to the level of New York prosecution? And one thing Alvin Bragg has done is try to go back to the beginning and bring Michael Cohen in again and again for new testimony. It was just a few months ago, Nora, I was sitting down for a cup of coffee in Washington with Mark Pomerantz, the prosecutor who resigned from this case because Alvin Bragg had decided at the time to not move forward with an indictment of Trump. But what has happened since I had that cup of coffee? Alvin Bragg keeps bringing back Michael Cohen. Sometimes I feel like Lanny Davis and Michael Cohen, Michael's lawyer, live outside of that courthouse. They're in front of it.
Well, Mark Pomerantz was critical of Alvin Bragg. That's why he resigned, wrote a whole book about it, which some people may say may prejudice this case. But what was the heart of what Mark Pomerantz, as the prosecutor, spent so much time working on this? I mean, he compared Donald Trump to Gotti. What was it that he said was at the heart of all of the things he said that the former president could be indicted on?
What Mark Pomerantz said was essentially an echo of what Jeff just laid out, that there was a conspiracy in Pomerantz's view to hide hush money payments, that there was criminal intent to expense these in a way that was illegal. He believed that the DA should move forward with an indictment at the time.
In furtherance of an election law violation so that he could run for office, or what's the conspiracy, or what's
Well, that's going to be very interesting because election law is usually prosecuted at a federal level. So what's the New York law that's going to be broken here if they're talking about campaign finance?
Well, and the other factor is that when Cy Vance, the previous DA, was looking into the case against Donald Trump, he was also looking into a different case. He was looking into property valuations, up for loans and down for taxes. And that's a different case than this case. Or is it? We're going to find out.
Okay, let's just a minute, because I just want to regroup here and let everyone know what we're looking at. These are live pictures from just outside what is the largest courtroom at this Manhattan criminal courthouse, where Judge Juan Merchan is there, and they will read the charges against Donald Trump. And there we see the district attorney, I believe, just quickly There are questions about whether he will be, in fact, inside that courtroom. Want to bring in our senior investigative correspondent, Catherine Herridge. She is there at the courthouse. And Catherine, who else do we expect to be inside that courtroom?
Well, Nora, good to be with you. We expect that courtroom on one of the upper levels in the courthouse behind me to be at capacity. Our colleagues Scott McFarland and Graham Cates will be in either the main courtroom or the overflow room. And to give you some context about what the demand was to watch history unfold, beginning yesterday at around 3 p.m. local time, a building just about 25 yards to my right, a lot of journalists and others began lining up for one of two color-coded passes. One pass would get them into that main courtroom where the former president will be arraigned. That's about 60 people. And then two overflow courtrooms, one 110 and the other 100. I also just want to make a note about the judge here, Judge Marchand. I spoke with a lawyer late yesterday who has appeared before the judge, and he described him as rough, tough, and someone who would not suffer unnecessary delays, and also emphasized that he has so much familiarity with the Trump Organization prosecution because he presided over that case, and significantly, he did not allow the defense attorneys in that case to argue something called selective prosecution. And that may be one of the key legal arguments for the former president as his case goes forward, Nora.
It's an excellent point, Catherine Herridge. Thank you. Also want to bring in Richard Esposito, the former NYPD deputy commissioner. And Richard, we are going to get pictures from still photographers at the beginning of this arraignment proceedings. But what we see right now is a very heavy law enforcement presence. Talk about that.
Yes, I think there are at least 250 reporters packed into the courtroom and the overflow room. In the courtroom itself, we're told at least 24 court officers. That's a very heavy presence. There's a source that says there'll be a court officer in every pew, and a source that says the Secret Service is keeping the seats closest to the aisle that the president would walk down empty, vacant for security reasons. So we're going to see a packed courtroom, a lot of blue and white shirts of security officers. There'll be senior court officials in the back of the room. Those are the ones with the white shirts. And you can see from the presence outside, and this was the courtroom Harvey Weinstein was tried in, it's already a significant presence right outside the court. And as you noted, the DA took that short walk that former President Trump's going to take from the elevator to the court in his case. And then we'll see how he's protected as he goes in.
And Richard, I understand you've been reporting this morning about a new spate of email threats against the district attorney. What have you learned?
What we learned this morning was from the folks who investigate cyber threats that they'd received another spate of these email threats against District Attorney Bragg, one of them saying there was a bomb, another one saying with a detonator. And it looked like the threats were coming through a Russian server. There's some suspicion that that could be mischief, hacking to cause trouble, but they still have to go through the server back to the internet provider and make sure it's not being masked and it's actually a domestic threat. Nothing has yielded anything that emergency service or bomb squads are concerned about, but they're going to run each of these down, Nora.
Richard Esposito, thank you. We should note that in New York, falsifying business records can be a crime, and we are told that Mr. Bragg has built his case around that very charge. Want to bring in Ricky Kleeman. Ricky, do we expect the district attorney to be there sitting at the table inside that courtroom?
It's really up to him. His assistants have handled this case throughout with the grand jury. His assistants are the people who will try the case. But he may want to show his presence, show he is unafraid, show this is his case, and take possession of a seat at the table, or he may not.
We have been reporting we're talking about more than 30 counts against Donald Trump. Will they all be felony counts?
We don't know. Certainly, it makes sense that if you're going to take a check and say that that is falsifying a business record along with an entry in a journal and say that that's a misdemeanor, that would be very foolish indeed. You may as well wrap it around the other crime that allegedly would be the crime of concealment, whether it's federal or state, and at that point make them all felonies.
On the grounds that this conduct essentially was intended to conceal another underlying crime.
Correct.
Perhaps an election law crime. On that note, we have an expert on that very topic, so I want to bring in Jerry Goldfeder. He is an election and campaign finance lawyer. Jerry, so good to have you with us. Answer that charge that has been made. Well, why is this illegal that Trump paid off someone he may have had an affair with? What's wrong with that?
Well, if he's good to see you, if it's proven that he has conspired, perhaps with Cohn, perhaps with the National Enquirer people, to unlawfully promote his own election, that's a violation of state election law. Normally, a federal candidate goes by federal election law, and the federal election law preempts, oversees, supersedes New York State and every state election law, except there are exceptions. So if, in fact, the indictment states that he conspired to promote his own election by unlawful means, by violating state election laws, Alvin Bragg is on solid ground.
And what would that mean in terms of when this case goes to trial?
It would mean that he has to, the district attorney needs to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, and the jury needs to accept the fact that, in fact, all these transactions, the hush money payments, were in furtherance of the presidential election. His defense is it has nothing to do with the election. It had to do with Melania, his family, God knows what. And the jury is going to have to adopt the district attorney's evidence, testamentary evidence and documentary evidence, beyond a reasonable doubt that, in fact, it was related to the election.
Well, why else would have Donald Trump given money to Stormy Daniels?
That's a good question, and we'll hear his defense. It's like when John Edwards was indicted a number of years ago for the very similar situation, and his defense was he was really trying to protect his family life, his reputation, having nothing to do with the campaign, and the jury in that case was not convinced by the prosecutor. So it's up to District Attorney Bragg to prove this case and for the jurors to adopt it, to accept that.
It's just extraordinary to think about what has happened in the last many years that Donald Trump ran for president and was president of the United States, and all these legal cases that have come about since.
And presumably that would go back to your point, Bob. Does the district attorney have any evidence that Donald Trump was thinking or trying to engage in this in the furtherance of getting around those campaign laws? Or does he have a witness beyond maybe Michael Cohen, maybe David Pecker, who says, we had a conversation specifically about this campaign piece of it, and that adds to, it's not just speculation, that you have somebody who was in the room when that conversation was happening and that Donald Trump was participating in that conversation.
And while this has been widely reported, just to remind everybody, Robert, again, because you just interviewed Michael Cohen, who was sent to jail because of this, how the money was funneled to Michael Cohen, who then paid Stormy Daniels, to just remind everybody.
So in 2016, Donald Trump's running for the presidency, and he wants to keep bad stories out of the news. And it's not illegal to have what's called a non-disclosure agreement. You can pay someone in this country to not speak about a certain issue if you do it above the level, on the level. But what happened here, according to Cohen's version of events, is that Donald Trump told him, when he was a candidate for the presidency, told his fixer, Michael Cohen, to take care, with David Pecker, working at the National Enquirer at the time, of this Stormy Daniels situation and potentially other allegations like Karen McDougal, women who have claimed to have had different kinds of encounters and affairs with Donald Trump.
She was the Playboy model?
Playboy model, Karen McDougal. And so you see what Cohen did is pay them, in Stormy Daniels' case, $130,000. But it was labeled as legal fees. And that labeling of legal fees is what's under scrutiny now by the district attorney of Manhattan. Instead of calling it a non-disclosure agreement and just saying it is what it is, it was labeled as legal fees. And that decision, alleged decision by Trump, implicates him in a possible conspiracy in the eyes of those investigating this case.
Let's bring in Nicole Killian, who covers Congress for us. And Nicole, we have seen a number of Republicans in Congress and others who hold political office denouncing the district attorney while not exactly defending Donald Trump. Break down that reaction for us.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what you've seen is a number of congressional Republicans really in lockstep here, whether you're looking at party loyalists like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was there in New York protesting near the courthouse, saying that Donald Trump is innocent and that this is a weaponization of government. This is a line that we are hearing from some party leaders as well, such as Kevin McCarthy, the House Speaker, who has called this an abuse of power and who has said that the House will hold the Manhattan DA to account. And you have 3 congressional committee chairs who have been trading letters back and forth with the district attorney, trying to get him to sit down for a transcribed interview. Where we really see the daylight here is more among Senate Republicans. For instance, Mitch McConnell, still suffering from a fall. He's been out of Congress for a couple of weeks now. Have not heard much reaction from him. Also, when you look at some of these 2024 candidates, while many have backed the former president, for instance, we know Governor Ron DeSantis may potentially launch a presidential bid for 2024. He has aligned himself with the former president on this, as have other presidential hopefuls. But you have people like Asa Hutchinson, the former governor of Arkansas, who just announced a couple of days ago, one of the first to come out and say that the former president should withdraw from this race. In fact, he told me a couple of weeks ago that he thinks the former president has disqualified himself by the way in which he handled himself during January 6th, and that in his view, this is just a distraction and a sideshow that the party doesn't need right now.
Yeah, Asa Hutchinson, the former Arkansas governor, departing from some of his Republican colleagues and drawing a line in the sand about whether Trump should continue this race.
It's an intriguing political moment because, with respect to the former governor of Arkansas, not someone with a high national profile, but it's someone with his stature who's deciding that this is a moment to get into the Republican presidential race. But you don't see Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin or Florida Governor Ron DeSantis suddenly announcing their campaigns because they know that Trump is now consolidating a lot of support. Yes, he has a new challenger in Asa Hutchinson, but that's about it at this point. What's also interesting, based on what we just heard from Nicole, is that the Republican Party, while publicly seem to be rallying around Trump, I don't see many other House Republicans there, Senate Republicans. Where are they? Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Georgia Congresswoman, is there.
Meaning it's a handful of people.
It's a handful of people. It's Marjorie Taylor Greene's a congresswoman who appeared with the white nationalists at an event a few years ago. Nick Fuentes, that's who she is. She has a high national profile. George Santos, most New Yorkers and people nationally, we don't need to go there, but we know he's controversial.
Admitted liar.
Admitted liar. And so that's who's showing up. Where are the other senators and House members? There's a reluctance for so many of them to get there in the arena with Trump at a time of trouble. They'll send a tweet. They'll make a statement, but they don't want to get too close to a situation that's volatile.
And that is the key question. Will the media spotlight on Trump motivate his base? Will it paralyze the Republican opponents? Will it help him win the Republican nomination for 2024? I want to bring in our chief Washington correspondent, Major Garrett. He is at Trump's Palm Beach, Florida resident, Mar-a-Lago. And Major, I know the president planning to return there tonight and speak to his crowd. What are you learning?
Yes. So, Nora, it's a New York story right now, but it's going to be a primetime Mar-a-Lago story this evening. The president will return to Mar-a-Lago and this evening give some remarks, probably in response to what Alvin Bragg, the district attorney in Manhattan, tells reporters and the nation about the indictment, its relationship to the law, and the facts. But here's something we already know. The former president of the United States wants to monetize this moment. He's been trying to monetize it for weeks, but he's really trying to monetize it this very moment, because if you, like many reporters and many Americans, get emails from the Trump campaign, you just got an email that said mugshot, new item. It's not the mugshot. It's just a Photoshop. It's, in every classical sense, a head fake. It's a picture of the president. It's not the mugshot. Mugshot's not going to be taken. It doesn't exist. But you can get that fake mugshot on a T-shirt if you send in, and here's the clever number, 47. Let's do the math. 45th president, Joe Biden 46th. 47. There we go. So in this moment when at the panel and throughout this entire judicial process, there's meticulous care about whether there will or won't be a mugshot, no, it doesn't really matter. In the Trump world and the monetization moment, It exists, if only for the purposes of raising campaign donations.
And Major, to do some drilling down on that, for people who think that they're sending in that $47 to help Donald Trump run for president, how much of that money is being spent on the campaign and how much of it is it being spent on his legal defenses?
So the campaign is the one sending out this email. It's not from one of his super PACs. It's the Joint Committee for Donald Trump for President. So it is a campaign solicitation. And the campaign, because the Republican National Committee will no longer pay Donald Trump's legal bills, will have to pay that. So you can further the campaign interest, the political interest of the former president, or you can help him out on the legal side. Either way, whatever the campaign decides to do with that money, it's up to the campaign, but it is clearly for the president's campaign in 2024, for the first Republican nomination, and if he secures it, the presidency of the United States.
So he can use it for legal fees?
Indeed. Look, campaigns have legal fees, and it would be up to the campaign to decide if this is the allocation that it wants to make in order to do that. And there are plenty of documents that show that the Trump campaign has allocated funds for legal expenses. This particular case, at this particular moment, we'll have to wait for the filings on that, but it is permissible.
And Major, what about what we're expecting to see tonight when Donald Trump returns to Mar-a-Lago?
So Mar-a-Lago is the place where he is safest. He is very revered. It is a private club, so a good number of the crowd tonight, we're estimating or getting estimates, 500 to 700 will be club members, and therefore fans and paying customers of Mar-a-Lago. There'll also be invited guests. Some members of Congress who have long been in the trenches with former President Trump may be here. And the length of the remarks, we don't know yet. And whatever they are now, and there's a sense we've gotten that they have some prepared remarks, but they are going to deal, at least in part, with what the district attorney in Manhattan says when he talks to reporters later this afternoon. And my guess is, whatever that district attorney says, Alvin Bragg, on behalf of this case, the facts, the assertions, and how they fit with New York law, the president will reshape his remarks to respond specifically to those assertions from the district attorney. But Mar-a-Lago is, if anything, a very safe space for former President Trump. He wants the primetime visibility. He wants to make sure he's on plenty of cable networks and churning the story as much as he possibly can, and, oh, not incidentally, monetize it along the way.
And there we see members of Trump's legal team that have just exited out those doors. So it probably means just any moment now we are going to see Donald Trump.
We just saw Boris Epstein, one of his longtime political and legal advisors there, walking out of the room.
Who is also under legal scrutiny right now. In some of these other cases, he's being questioned.
We should note that in that group of people that we just saw, not only Boris Epstein, but of course Joe Tacopina, who we've seen on television, as well as Susan Necheles, who is one of his Trump defense attorneys as well. Let's listen in now.
President Trump, will you come speak to us? President Trump?
That was a sober-looking President Trump.
No handcuffs that we saw, walking with his arms.
I wonder if he made a decision, even though a member of his team said that he may speak to the cameras there, if he decided this was not a shot or a piece of sound he wanted to be remembered for.
Or maybe his legal team suggested that it's not the appropriate time.
Yeah. And not every, he's a former television producer. But at the end of the day, go back to what we heard right when this indictment came down. He didn't like it. He was stunned by it. He didn't think Bragg was going to move forward. He doesn't want to be arrested. He doesn't want to be arraigned. Yes, he's going to use it for his political campaign. But personally, this is not a moment he has welcomed, based on our reporting.
I wonder if Scott Frederickson is still with us, who is a former federal prosecutor who has focused on white-collar criminal defense. And Scott, you see the president's face there, and as you know, this can be a sobering moment when you're under arrest and you've been fingerprinted and read your rights.
Well, that's exactly right. The fact is, for legal purposes, an arraignment is simply a start of proceedings. It really has little consequences other than we get to see the charges today. But there is an emotional impact, in my experience as a prosecutor and defense counsel, that is rather stunning. It's the first time for most people when they're exposed to our criminal justice system. They realize they're in custody. They're with law enforcement. They are not free to move. They see bars. They see a holding cell. They see locked doors. They realize their freedom is no longer theirs. So for most individuals, this experience is embarrassing, humiliating, and somewhat frightening. They see the future they might have.
He's technically under arrest right now?
Mm-hmm.
That's correct.
I have seen, to echo Scott's comments, that when I have brought people, particularly white-collar people, into being processed, that even the most arrogant, even the most boisterous, suddenly become very, very quiet. Mm-hmm. It is sobering as your word. That really is the right word. It really dawns on you that your life will never be the same.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Well, going back to Bob's point, it's wise to remember that this is also may very well be the staging that Donald Trump, for whatever reason, wants at the moment. But the other thing is that Donald Trump does not like to be constrained when he doesn't want to be constrained. And if this is a moment of constraint, that would be uncomfortable if that, in fact, is what we're seeing and not a staged determination on his part.
I want to bring back in Richard Esposito, because, Richard, you can talk about what's just happened in the past 20 minutes.
It's a very sobering 20 minutes. You walk into an office with district attorney's office investigators and prosecutors. They inform you you're under arrest. That's a sobering moment right there. You read your Miranda rights, and it's explained to you how to put your fingers onto a electronic pad where your fingerprints will be taken. It's a moment when people often say you look over your shoulder and look at the things you might not ever see again, whether it's a taxi passing or someone you used to know, because for many defendants, this is the start of a long stay in jail.
We should just note what you just saw were the still photographers who were allowed inside the courtroom to take a picture at the beginning of these proceedings. Those will be published shortly. We will bring those to you. We should also note we have reporters from CBS News, one inside that very courtroom, who will be able to give a bird's eye view. They are not allowed to use their electronic devices right now, but we will have a report. We also have other reporters in those outside overflow rooms as well, so we can tell you exactly what happened inside.
And before we get that picture, which has an important role in our legal system, and we can talk about it once we get it, but can we go back just a second to the picture being sent out by the Trump campaign? He's running as an outlaw. This is a way in which today is a reality created by the judicial system, but then there's the circus reality, which is there was no mugshot. But they've created one in order to create a reality about an outlaw kind of candidate. That's, again, a way in which the unreality of the circus, which we've seen through the Trump years, which is a person who's very skilled at creating his own reality, is bumping up with the real reality, which is there's no mugshot, but also that he was arrested today.
You know, Robert, I was struck by when Richard was talking about what Donald Trump just went through, being surrounded by these prosecutors, being fingerprinted, being read his rights. It popped into mind as someone who has spent some time with Donald Trump, and I know you've spent a lot of time with him for interviews that you've done with Bob Woodward. He's a man that likes to be in charge of the room. He takes up a lot of oxygen. He talks a lot. He's domineering. He can be aggressive. In this case, he would not be able to be the Donald Trump that we all know.
The first time I met Donald Trump back in 2011, went up to Trump Tower, and you go to that 26th floor office, what's on the wall? Pictures of himself on magazine covers, pictures of himself with celebrities. Yeah. This is someone who for his entire life has studied the image of Donald Trump, cultivated the image of Donald Trump. You think about him in interviews. I've always said it's best to interview Trump over the phone, because in person there's always the character of Trump, the presentation of Trump. This has been key to his business career. It's not just about buildings and golf courses. It's about marketing a brand. When you look at his valuations of his fortune over the years, you'd always value his brand at the highest level of his entire fortune. And so now to have his brand, his image associated with this sober walk into a courtroom in Lower Manhattan, this is an area that's not full of skyscrapers. This is not an area where a lot of people go to dinner at night, though Soho is nearby. What you're looking at is a place where they often film the TV show Law and Order. This is gritty. This is not the Donald Trump image he has worked so hard to maintain.
And he did that in New York. You know, I covered him here in New York for years, and he was Mr. New York. You know, the people on this, hey, Donald, they loved him. But now he comes here and it's like he's a visitor in his own hometown. He doesn't hang around too long. He gets back to Florida, where now he feels more comfortable. But here is where he became who he is, in part because of that branding of buildings and his reputation, his TV shows, but also because he is someone from Queens. He grew up with this chip on his shoulder, always wanted to fit in with the wealthiest of Manhattan's wealthy. And here he is, humbled in this courthouse in Lower Manhattan. It is really a sobering picture.
And he spent a lot of his career in New York working politicians and officials like the former Manhattan District Attorney Robert Morgenthau, with whom he had a long relationship, because he always felt that you could work the system, and that's not possible for him at this moment.
And he did that as a Democrat and someone who funded many Democratic causes before switching parties to run and become a Republican president of the United States. Ricky, let's talk about what's happening right now inside this courtroom.
Well, I can assume that inside the courtroom that it will get called to order, or has been called to order by the court clerk. People will rise for the judge to come in. The judge will then make an order to unseal the indictment. At that point, the defendant will be able to see it, his lawyers will be able to see it, and hopefully soon we will be able to see it. There may be proceedings after that time in terms of any conditions that the judge may want or the DA may want in terms of his release. He will be released. He does not have to post any bail.
The doors are open again. We're watching this very closely as a number of different officials are led inside or out of these courtrooms with heavy law enforcement present. Let's bring in Jerry Goldfeder, who is an election and campaign finance lawyer. And Jerry, what's been happening inside that courtroom right now?
Well, they're getting ready for the judge to take the bench and to begin proceedings. And let's not make any mistake about it. This judge is a very serious lawman. He will control this courtroom. He will make certain that everything goes according to protocol in a very serious, somber, sober way. So whatever kinds of drama we have outside the building or even in the corridors are not going to occur in this courtroom. And I think that's the reason why the judge made the determination not to have cameras in the courtroom. I think the procedure is going to go just by the book according to the judge's wishes.
We are just getting the first picture in from inside that courtroom with Donald Trump surrounded by his new legal team, as well as some of his previous legal counsel there, and facing these particular charges. We should talk about Judge Juan Merchan, who has previously presided over the convictions and guilty plea just last year of 2 Trump Organization companies and their former chief financial officer, Alan Weisselberg. He's also overseeing the criminal proceedings involving Steve Bannon. He has been a justice in Manhattan State Supreme Court for 14 years, and he's been described as someone who is pretty straightforward and tough. One question is whether he will impose a gag order today.
The difficulty, Nora, about the gag order is this. How do you enforce it? You have someone who is running for the office of president in the United States. So he violates the gag order, should one have been imposed. What are you going to do? Hold him in contempt and put him in jail? That's ridiculous. So even though I think a gag order may well be warranted to have both sides not talk about this case, I don't think it can be enforced. So why do it?
Okay, what about then the continued attacks on this judge and today his family as well? Previously, Donald Trump had put on his social media that this judge hates me. Today, he denounced his family as well. Can Donald Trump continue to personally attack the judge, the district attorney, and others.
Well, the difficulty is what I say. How do you stop him except by throwing him in jail, which does not really serve anyone? The difficulty is really also his argument that goes back to January 6th, free speech.
Well, I want to bring in Jerry Goldfeder one more time because, Jerry, we already know Donald Trump wants this judge to recuse himself. He wants the trial moved to Staten Island.
That's right. And I think all of his statements on his social media and as well as pumping up his crowds go to his strategy of trying to move this trial away from New York County and to try to get the judge, if he can't do that, to try to get rid of this judge because he believes, and perhaps rightly so, that this judge really knows him, really knows his organization, and is probably not disposed to look upon him in any favorable light. So I think that is his strategy at this point. I don't think it's going to work. I think this judge is going to retain jurisdiction, and I think this trial is going to occur in New York County.
Donald Trump has been arrested. He's been booked. He's been fingerprinted. He is now being likely read this indictment, which we are all anxiously awaiting to hear what is in it.
He's learning the facts of the case right now, and his ears are coming whatever is up there against him. Ricky, I want to ask you a question, which is, as one of his lawyers, is the advice likely to be, hey, stop attacking the judge, because the judge may hold your future in some of his rulings. I mean, it may make your future easier or harder, depending on how he rules. So isn't it always better not to attack the judge?
Of course, it's better not to attack the judge. And of course, if I were his lawyer, and I'm sure that when you have lawyers who have real quality, the addition of Todd Blanche is a wonderful addition. They are telling him to just stop. They are telling him that anything he says could be used against him in a court of law. You do not want your client talking, let alone threatening. I do think that it really is true what Jerry says, that this is a strategy to try to get the judge to recuse himself. I also agree it's not going to work. So what you do is you've gotten under the skin of a judge, but a judge like this, with his reputation, is going to push it aside, and he is going to rule fairly in the courtroom. But does it serve you in the end? You don't want that subconscious going to say that this is someone who is threatening me, let alone my family.
In recent days, I was talking to people close to Donald Trump, and I said, what's he saying behind the scenes? And they said, it's not just what he's saying, it's what he's sending. He has been sending some friends and advisors articles about the crowd size in Waco, Texas, where he recently had a rally where his message was very grievance-driven. And that is a sign to me as a reporter that what's coming is political war. If you're the judge in this case or the prosecutor, you may want this to unfold in a certain way, abiding by certain norms, but you are in a norm-free zone when you deal with former President Donald Trump. He is on the march, on the campaign trail, trying to run for the Republican nomination, and he has shown in every instance of his recent life that he will shatter a norm at a moment's notice if he believes it'll get him ahead.
Well, he tried to shatter norms by inciting a mob on the Capitol of the United States, the January 6th insurrection. He now faces legal jeopardy because of that. And those that ended up storming the Capitol have also met the long arm of the law, with more than 1,000 charged and many of them in jail for what they did. So when people question, will there be accountability for the former president and those who answered his call, we have begun to see some accountability. No?
Yeah, and I think, you know, if those cases, the January 6 cases, have helped law enforcement in this case. And I say that because you have this former president who's trying to rile up his supporters. But if you look at what some of his...
There weren't big protests here in New York.
Exactly, right? Because some of his supporters are saying, wait a second, it's a trap. It's a, you know, false flag operation. The police are going to get us if we show up. Or they don't want to go to jail. Exactly, exactly.
I want to bring in Scott McFarland. We mentioned we have reporters who have been witnessing what's happening inside that courtroom. Scott, tell us what you've been seeing.
Donald Trump has just pleaded not guilty to 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree. He's seated at the defense table, surrounded by 3 defense attorneys, wearing his suit and his red tie, spoke in a pretty loud voice when he said not guilty, as the clerk of Judge Juan Marchand read the top line, 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree. This is ongoing as we speak, Nora, but we have this development from the courtroom. This arraignment began moments ago, took very little time to get to the plea from the 45th President of the United States.
Scott McFarlane, you are the only one reporting this right now. You've been witnessing what happened inside that courtroom. What did it look like when Trump entered?
Well, he walked in slowly, and once he sat down, the pool photographers, the still photographers were brought in, a few of them, and he smiled in their direction as they got their cameras ready. They read the case number. This is for the history book. This case is number 71543-23 here in the Manhattan courthouse. He sat with no paper, no pens in front of him. His attorneys all had books out and pens out. He just sat with his hands in his lap, kind of hunched over at this old wooden defense table. This is such an old, dank courtroom. It's not the palatial or grand courtrooms in the federal system. And it's a very humble courtroom, and he is sitting with his shoulders slumped, his hands in his lap.
What can you tell us about those 34 counts? We don't have any idea yet what's in that indictment. What have you heard?
Well, this is what we're going to find out in the coming minutes, but it's all the same count according to the clerk who read the indictment. 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree. There is possibly some connective tissue between falsifying business records and some other crime, but that's what's ongoing now in the courtroom. There is an overflow courtroom just across the hall, and both of them are pretty jam-packed with spectators, not just journalists, but citizens who waited in line since 1 in the morning to get a seat in here. Former president, as you'd imagine, Nora, is just surrounded by law enforcement, not just Secret Service, but there is New York police, there is New York State court security, and there is a group of police out in the hallway monitoring activity here. No phones allowed in the courtroom, and the judge got a challenge from the media organizations to open this up to phones and laptops and to cameras, and the judge rejected all those motions. So all this is happening behind closed doors with a feed, a video and audio feed going across the hallway to an overflow room.
Scott McFarlane has been witnessing Donald Trump inside that courtroom as they read the criminal charges against him. Scott, just to recap, what did Donald Trump do when asked for his plea?
He answered immediately in a voice that was noticeably louder than the attorneys who were speaking here today, and said simply, not guilty. No adjectives before it, nothing after it, just not guilty. And at this point, they're running through the procedures that will happen after this arraignment ends. There are going to be certainly deadlines set for motions, for future hearings. All that's happening as I'm speaking to you, Nora. But the bottom line here is it's 34 counts of the same charge, according to the clerk. 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree. There's more to gather, but let me just paint a picture for you here, Nora. This is such a humble place. The 15th floor of this courthouse in Manhattan looks like an old middle school hallway. That type of flooring, that type of walls. It is sweltering, stuffy hot in here and in the courtroom. And all of this looks like something out of the TV show Night Court, not something out of one of the grand courthouses in Washington or in the federal system nationwide. The limited camera access here, which the Trump team asked for, saying cameras might turn this into a circus-like atmosphere, are perhaps sparing some of the images of a very meek and humble place.
Scott, you are the only one who has come out from that overflow room to give us this first-hand account. It is riveting to listen to the details that you have. I know Robert Costa has a question for you.
Scott, terrific reporting. It's just amazing to get these vivid details right by the moment. Did Trump stand up? Did the former president stand up when he pleaded not guilty? Did he stay seated? Give me the whole version of events from your eye.
Everybody is seated, at least for the opening minutes of this, Bob. Trump is seated, his attorneys on either side. He's got 2 attorneys on his right, 1 attorney on his left. The attorneys we've seen on television included Joe Tacopina is to Trump's left, Susan McAuliffe to his right, and Tom Blanche, his newly hired attorney, further to his right. He is seated, Trump and his defense team, to the judge's right, facing the back of the courtroom. For the spectators, Trump is to the left. The prosecutors are on the opposite side, and I should note this and underscore this. Alvin Bragg is in the front row of the audience on the prosecution side, sitting in the middle seat in the front row watching all this close up.
That's interesting. So the district attorney there inside the courtroom, not sitting at the table, but they're observing as well. And Scott, since you were there observing, what about the judge? Did he say anything? We were noting earlier, of course, that it was just this morning, the 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time hour, that Trump took to social media to attack him and his family personally.
Well, the judge first had to deal with another challenge before this proceeding began. Obviously, it's 2:50 p.m. here on the East Coast. This was supposed to begin at 2:15 Eastern Time. What ate up some of the balance of the time was Trump arriving about 10 minutes late with his defense team into the courtroom, potentially for procedural issues, but also a lawyer representing 20 media organizations tried to open this thing up, tried to get cameras turned on, tried to allow phone use and computer use inside the courtroom, and tried to get access from some of the people in the audience, including the media, to sit in the jury box so that they could see the former president's face. I can see the former president's face because I'm watching via a remote feed in the overflow room. The judge shot down all those challenges, but Juan Marchand, the Manhattan judge handling this case, had to deal with that issue first, which is why the arraignment has just now begun. And I'll underscore, because I think it's important, Nora, the arraignment is still underway.
Scott McFarlane, want to stay with you to get more of your account about what's happening inside that courtroom. Just to let everybody know, Donald Trump right now inside this courtroom, he arrived for his arraignment at about 2:30 p.m., taking the first steps into his life as a criminal defendant. According to Scott McFarlane, read 34 charges against him as part of this indictment. And I'll let you describe it again for us, Scott. How exactly did it go? Who read the indictment? And then how did Trump deliver his not guilty plea?
So in the Manhattan court at arraignment, it's the clerk of the judge who reads aloud the indictment. So it was the judge's clerk, Judge Juan Marchand's clerk, who read out 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree. But before she did so, Nora, she read out the official case number, which is now for the history books. This is indictment number 71543-23. The dash 23, of course, is the calendar year. That's the criminal case number for this indictment. The judge, after hearing these arguments to open up or make more transparent these procedures, pledged to review the request from media for future proceedings. So this may be the first and last proceeding in this criminal case in which media are not permitted to bring phones or computers, or which cameras are turned off. So this may be the only time we're flying blind while trying to watch Donald Trump in a criminal case. But as of this moment, he is now an accused criminal in the Manhattan court system, facing 34 counts.
As Scott just noted, it is worth reminding people that what's happening inside this courtroom will not be broadcast or photographed. We just got a couple of these still pictures from the very top of it. Reporters are inside. Our own Graham Cates is inside and will bring us more details from what Scott has already mentioned. They cannot use phones or laptops to provide updates. We have to wait until the end of this proceeding. But Scott McFarlane was in an overflow room and witnessed Donald Trump plead not guilty, was able to bring us some of the initial moments from just what happened in very dramatic recounting of this incredible moment.
Scott, when the clerk read the charges to the former president, was the former president addressed as former President Trump or just called Mr. Donald John Trump?
There were different variations of that, Bob. First of all, his defense attorney, Tom Blanche, introduced him as former President Donald J. Trump, but the clerk referred to him as Donald J. Trump. And Donald J. Trump is the named defendant here. But that distinction was made between the defense counsel and the clerk. All of this is clear to hear in the courtroom and in the overflow room. And let me explain why. These are pretty moderate-sized rooms. I mean, think of a large high school classroom, maybe a small school library or cafeteria. This is a small place, and it's a grand contrast to the federal court system, to the other courts that we walk into in which there are spectacle trials or spectacle arraignments. This just feels and looks different.
Scott McFarlane, thank you. Stay with us, if you will. I know John Dickerson is here with us as well.
Scott, you mentioned that DA Alvin Bragg is there. Anything else from the prosecution table? And also, did everybody march right in and take their seats, or was there any? Sometimes there's a little bit of milling about in which the lawyers at least nod at each other, or they have some commerce that they've already engaged in setting this moment up, and they will have to engage with each other again. Was there any of that in the courtroom?
Yeah, we see that so frequently in criminal cases where groups just kind of assemble piecemeal. That was not the case here. I mean, Secret Service is running security along with New York Police and New York State Court Police. There was a regiment here, John, where everybody was seated in place with security in place before the prosecution team arrived, which happened almost exactly at 2:15 Eastern Time. The Trump team, including the former president, arrived about 10 minutes later at 2:25 Eastern Time. But once the defendant was seated and once the defense team was seated, the judge entered moments later with the clerk, announced the initiation of this proceeding. But there was a small and micro proceeding before it, that matter of dealing with the media request for access. Once the judge disposed of that with no comment from the prosecutors or the defense attorneys, they moved on to begin this historic indictment.
I got some new reporting just in from our investigative producer, Pat Milton, noting that these charges are all Class E felonies. And to note, felonies carry prison time, misdemeanors do not. Ricky, we've been talking about this. What do you think the significance is that the district attorney's office, Bragg's office, bumped up all these charges to these Class E felonies, which I understand are the lowest class of felonies in New York State Penal Code?
Correct. From a misdemeanor punishment of a year to a Class E felony with a punishment of 4 years. The ultimate punishment is today fairly irrelevant, except for the fact that it carries more time. Because what we're dealing with here is the question of what are these charges? So it seems to me we still haven't seen the indictment, that if you're dealing with one business record that they say was falsified, that it becomes one count, and then one check becomes one count. The one thing we have learned, I think, from Scott's reporting is that this all concerns the activities involving allegedly Donald Trump with Michael Cohen, David Pecker with the National Enquirer, and Stormy Daniels, and not other charges. I think that's a big revelation, if I heard it correctly.
Scott, is that correct?
Yeah, although I'll have to admit and acknowledge that we interjected into the airwaves here by bolting out of this hearing before it was complete. There's clearly going to be a connected tissue between these charges and potentially some other misconduct or allegation. And our team in the courtroom still is going to bring that out to us in the coming minutes. But we know the top line here. The top line is 34 counts. And the news of the hour is Donald Trump pleaded not guilty.
Scott, thank you. I want to bring in Jerry Goldfeder, who's been listening along and is an election and campaign finance lawyer. And Jerry, your reaction to what we've just heard.
Well, it sounds like the campaign finance violations enabled Alvin Bragg to bump up the false business records charge to a felony. We haven't seen the indictment just yet, but that's what it sounds like. And I'm curious to ask Scott whether or not the judge has made set any deadlines for motion to dismiss the indictment, motion to change venue, that kind of thing.
I'm glad you asked, because it allows me to say that this proceeding is still underway. Business underway, if not now, quite soon. And also, what we have from our reporting at this point is a floor, not necessarily a ceiling. We know there are 34 charges or 34 counts of falsifying business records. It does not mean that this proceeding is over, and the rest of our CBS News team could be reporting out more allegations against the former president, potentially more charges. I just don't want to close the door on there being more added as this day goes along.
It's an excellent point. Scott, are you allowed to, I know you just left that overflow room to bring us this breaking news, are you allowed to go back in?
I'm going to make it happen, Nora.
Pressure's on.
All right, Scott. Well, why don't we are hanging on every detail that you have been reporting. So why don't you head back in
click it?
Unmute.
Hi, Ariel.
All right. Thank you all for joining the stream on Atlanta News First Plus. I'm Doug Reardon, political reporter here at the station, and let's just start from scratch here. For those of you just joining us on our coverage, what you're looking at right now is a live shot outside of the Manhattan District Court, where Donald Trump has appeared for his arraignment, and now we know has pleaded not guilty to 34 counts of falsifying business records. It's not a huge mystery as to what these charges are tied to. We know that back before the former president apologies. We know that back before the former president had started running for the White House in 2016, he had made some hush money payments. He had made some hush money payments to two women who had claimed to have had extramarital affairs with him. Of course, that would have been very damaging information at the time, although it kind of came out anyways while he was running in the final weeks and days of the campaign there. Stormy Daniels, the adult film star, and Karen McDougal, who was a former Playboy model, were the two women at the center of this.
Called a Clayton motion. And what a Clayton motion is that you say it is in the interest of justice, regardless of the merits of the case, to dismiss this case. So they have two ways to go about it. One other part of the motion to dismiss that we know, according to Donald Trump's lawyer, Joe Tacopina, that they're looking at is not only do they believe that there is not a law that prevents this case, that allows this case to go forward, and that this is a misreading of the law. But they also claim that there's a statute of limitations issue. All of these are ethical and proper motions for a defense lawyer to make. Whether or not they're going to be granted is way down the road. And if they're not, it's going to a trial. Because, Jeff, I know you were provoking, but there is never going to be a plea.
And just to build on Ricky's points, when I was talking in the last 24 hours to Trump's attorneys, they say they're going to make a case in the dismissal motion that Trump is being selectively prosecuted in this case, that because he's a former president, a Republican, that he is being prosecuted for that reason. So that is going to be at least part of the argument they are making as they try to dismiss this relatively quickly in the coming weeks.
Just want to note now, Donald Trump has been inside that courtroom for about 40 minutes now. He entered at about 2:30 Eastern time. According to our own Scott McFarland, who witnessed the proceedings inside from an overflow room, the Manhattan prosecutors accused Donald Trump of trying to cover up a potential sex scandal during the 2016 presidential campaign with hush money payments. They were bumped up, these charges, to Class E felonies, meaning that this conduct essentially was intended to conceal another underlying crime. This now opens Trump up to not only be the first president or former president indicted, but now to face criminal charges. We are awaiting many more details from what's happening inside this courtroom, as no doubt his attorneys are trying to move to dismiss this case. Dates set, more particular specifics about the indictment that we still don't know. All we know, according to Scott McFarland, was that was Donald Trump himself who said in a loud voice, not guilty.
And as Ricky so eloquently explained, this is going to take a lot of time. We're looking at weeks and months ahead. And politically, John, I'm so curious how this is going to play out as you have an ongoing Republican presidential race. What's coming up this summer? Debates, primary debates. Then you're going to have major election nights next year in 2024. And so you're going to have an ongoing potential trial while someone runs for the presidency of the United States and could even be convicted of a crime down the line and serve in the American presidency.
And not just in this case. The E. Jean Carroll case is, I think, being heard next week, where Joe Tacopina is defending him against a charge of rape. A civil case. Then there is the January 6th case. There is the documents, the classified documents found at Mar-a-Lago, the Georgia case. What's the timeline on those other cases?
Well, I thought the Georgia case, the judge who ruled about whether the information could be released to the public said, I don't want to do that until there is an indictment, because there were indictments that were expected to come as a result of that. But of course, there was the special grand jury that met, and then they had to impanel another regular grand jury. So,
but they haven't done that yet in Georgia. Fani Willis has not made a decision on whether she's going to convene a regular grand jury to issue criminal indictments in Georgia. Here's the one clue we have about the special counsel. What is he doing? Actions always speak. He keeps compelling everyone at the highest level to testify as soon as possible. This special counsel, Jack Smith, keeps going before the judge and says, I don't care about the privilege argument. Bring him in. We need this testimony. That's a sign.
All right, we want to welcome everybody back into our Atlanta News First Plus streaming coverage of the arraignment of former President Donald Trump. A couple new things we've learned since this afternoon, since before the former president went into the courtroom. He is facing 34 counts related to falsifying business records, all the same charge, all in the first degree. Of course, those could very well be tied to other things that, again, we aren't privy to because we don't have cameras in that courtroom. We don't have reporters in that courtroom. Only still photography was allowed. But we do know that there are those 34 counts of falsifying business records that could be tied to some specific acts. We also know that from reporting that's come out of that building in Manhattan that the president spoke 2 words today. He said not guilty when asked for his plea, nothing more than that. And not surprising for someone who has maintained his innocence throughout this entire process. Of course, this all stems back from prior to the 2016 election when the president first took office, hush money payments that were made to 2 women to try to cover up allegedly extramarital affairs over the course of many, many years. One, a former adult film star, Stormy Daniels, the other, a former Playboy model, Karen McDougal. Those payments, of course, at the center now of all of this. And so we're keeping a very close eye on what's happening. This is far from the only legal jeopardy that the president has found himself in. This just happens to be the first case that has seen or returned an indictment, this one out of Manhattan. But of course, we know that there are several federal investigations, one tied to the president's conduct on the day of January 6, 2020, when those riots at the Capitol happened that turned deadly. The other over documents, some classified, that were found at his estate in Florida at Mar-a-Lago, where, of course, we know that there were boxes and boxes of documents that the president potentially improperly took from the White House with him back to his personal residence as a private citizen. And then, of course, there is that state probe in Georgia, right here in Fulton County, where we are now, that had to do with his alleged tampering of the results of the 2020 election here in Georgia. And, of course, that famous phone call with Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, where he asked the Secretary of State to, quote, find him 11,780 votes, one more than the margin of victory that President Biden enjoyed here in Georgia. So, we've been analyzing this all day. We're going to continue to do that now. We have Josh Schiffer here, who is an attorney, and of course, it's always good to see you, Josh, and we appreciate your insight and perspective on this. So now we know what we know, 34 counts tied to falsifying these business records. But again, I mean, these 34 counts really could be tied to other acts that aren't necessarily identified in these charges. It could get more specific than that. We just don't know right now.
Absolutely. And people say go into the law and it's boring. No, this is as exciting and gripping as you get.
Who says that?
This is absolutely history happening before our eyes. I want to go to something you just talked about, those 34 charges. We don't have the actual contents of the individual indictments. Each one of those charges is going to specifically identify the violation of the law that DA Bragg's office is accusing the president of. You are entitled as a citizen to an accusation or indictment that's perfect in form as well as substance. So we are going to get, once we have obtained copies of this indictment, a public record, we're going to be able to begin analyzing and looking at the roadmap we believe DA Bragg is going to follow in prosecuting this case. One of the big questions about this is this simply a documents case, or are they going to need additional testimony? The grand jury certainly heard from many, many people. The conflicts in that testimony can be the probable cause that brings about or alerts the investigation into alleged violations of law. But now the district attorney's office has the obligation to prove that violation, each one of those violations, one at a time, beyond a reasonable doubt. The highest threshold in law. President Trump, as all accused are, has substantial rights. He gets to confront the accusers, and he gets to take advantage of all of his due process rights, beginning today with this now 40-minute arraignment, a period of time much longer than people thought, much longer than the average arraignment lasts. And I'm, on the edge of my seat wondering exactly what's happening in this room. Is the judge addressing the potential gag order? Are there questions about presentation or due process issues? this is as exciting as it gets when it comes to criminal law.
Right, and like you said, I mean, we, as a reporter, and you as an attorney, I mean, we've been in the courtroom for countless arraignments. These are not typically long processes. I mean, you go in, they have you state your name, they read you your charges, you plead guilty or not guilty, or something to that effect, and then you're out the door. I mean, 5 minutes is pretty typical for an arraignment. This is now well beyond that. We're closing in on an hour now.
Absolutely. And I tell you, I get more interested by the minute because, right like you described, most arraignments, you show up in front of a judge and the judge says, "Dear sir or madam, you are charged with these charges." We can either hand you the piece of paper where they're all written down, and you can sign it and we can all leave, or if you really want, I can read you the actual accusations or indictments and put them on the public record. Since most people have a lawyer and can read, we just take the paperwork and go. It's a momentary process. Now this goes back to our most ancient rights. When people didn't know how to read, you have the right to know what they're charging you with. That's the biggest and most important central function of arraignment, is the formal notice of the charges and specifically how you are being charged, because that's where your defense begins. And now we're going to begin picking apart these indictments and seeing exactly what pathway DA Bragg is going to pursue.
Right, and of course we mentioned earlier no cameras in the courtroom, so we couldn't hear these charges being read out, you know, audibly, and of course we don't know anything besides the fact that the president simply pleaded not guilty. You know, what we do kind of know and can kind of logically reason here is that some of this has to do with these alleged hush money payments made to these two women to prevent, we assume, damaging information coming out before the 2016 election. We talked to an attorney yesterday who made a really good point. There's nothing illegal about NDAs. There's nothing illegal about hush money, but it all depends on how you categorize these as expenses. And so, again, I don't want to hone in too much on what we don't know, but assuming that these hush money payments have something to do with these 34 counts of falsifying business records, I mean, pretty safe to assume that, you know, if that's what is at the center of these, that these were not categorized correctly.
Yeah, there's the rub. It's absolutely legal for you to purchase or pay someone or compensate them for doing or not doing something that's legal. Keeping your mouth shut is totally legal. You can pay someone, compensate them to keep their mouth shut. Absent some other affirmative duty to speak, that's totally legal. So it's not the actual payments. And people have their silence bought in a vast number of different situations. Very often in any injury case, you're going to have a confidentiality provision because it doesn't serve the party's interest in having the private information shared, and confidentiality is bought and sold all the time. You mentioned non-disclosures. Very common in the workplace. From now, much more common in more labor-related jobs than ever before. They're expanding. So that's not a crime. The crime and the real question for DA Bragg is what's in these 34 individual incidents that shows the violation of a state law involving false records and how they are used. There's got to be a causal connection explained through, you know, as a thread running through these 34 counts. We're not going to know about that until we see the actual indictments. Then we're going to begin constructing how DA Bragg's office got there, and we'll look at what witnesses appeared and what witnesses we believe the state is looking at in order to how they structured that argument. Meanwhile, Donald Trump's team is doing the exact same thing in showing researching each one of these 34 issues, almost like independent cases, to see how and best to where to best defend against them, because they will have a day in court. The schedule is probably being made by the judge right now. We may get a scheduling order at the conclusion of this.
Right, and just to let everybody know, there's some video of the president arriving to his arraignment today at that courthouse down there in Manhattan. And so we are waiting to hear, by the way, from Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg. We are told that around 3:30 he should be facing the media and making some comments about what actually went on in that courtroom there today. And so very anxiously waiting to hear what he has to say, because again, as little as we've heard from former President Trump and his legal team, we have had perhaps even less of a direction on how this is all going from the Manhattan DA's office. So, you know, I think as far as how this all works, we're very familiar with this process. I cover the courts, you work in the courts. But for those who aren't familiar with it, I mean, like we said earlier, typically you come in, your name is confirmed, and you read your charges and you enter a plea. But there's a lot more that goes on behind the scenes that even when we televise these arraignments, people don't see. What could be reasonably expected, you know, from today's procedures? I mean, Donald Trump, I understand that he may not have had a mugshot because the DA's office was saying, well, his image is so publicly available. Anyways, there was no reason for it. But when you're booked and processed on a charge, such as the ones that the former president we now know is facing, what happens? What's the process here, and what is happening before and after this courtroom arraignment?
So I'm going to talk in kind of generals because there are specific policies for each individual jurisdiction. We call them local rules. So please, this doesn't, you know, these aren't absolutely 100% what's going to happen every time. But generally, when an announcement of a charge is made, you're either in custody of the police or soon to be in the custody of the police. And that's what happened here. This was announced. He wasn't picked up driving a car. No, it was announced after the grand jury returned the true bill of indictment. He was notified by the DA's office that there was a charge and that he was expected to, you know, facilitate the orderly turn-in and booking. Now, if you're not a high-profile individual, this is, like you talk about, a really pretty fast and no-muss process. You show up, especially if there's not going to be a bond or if it's not a serious charge. You show up, you see the judge hands you the charges. For low-level charges, very often there's going to be a release on your own recognizance, or if there's a bond posted, it's been posted already. You accept the charges, you turn around and you leave. You might have a scheduling order from the court, depending on your local court's preferences. Now, this is a little bit different because of the profile of the former president and the security involved. As we understand, DA Bragg's office basically gave Donald Trump's team a lot more flexibility than the average person would receive. There was an option to show up without handcuffs. Most clients don't get given that as an option. There was the option to really set the schedule. That's very considerate, and it's based on the integrity of the people involved and the fact that our system is a system built on professionalism, and Donald Trump has retained professional attorneys whose character and reputation is on the line. So we all knew that Mr. Trump, or President Trump, was going to come in and follow the basic pathway, which he has appeared to do. Now, that doesn't mean they're not going to stand up and fight on the defendant's behalf. Donald Trump has an extraordinarily accomplished legal team. Some would potentially say it's almost getting too big. You worry about too many cooks. But he has very accomplished lawyers who are going to ensure that all of the due process is explored fully, is completed fully, and that is attended to fully by the state. The state has those obligations, both the DA's office and the actual court itself, to ensure due process is met. Otherwise, it creates an appeals issue. They are going to make sure that Donald Trump is afforded every specific legality that could be expected and is required. My big question at the conclusion of this is what other issues got discussed during what's now almost an hour-long arraignment.
Right.
Number one on my brain is the gag order. There's a lot of reasons for one, there's a lot of reasons against one, and they are not nearly as common as people think. Its inclusion in this case would be earth-shattering.
Right, and perhaps a little ironic given that this all started with an NDA as well. And, you know, I mean, let's just watch this video of the president leaving the courtroom as we talk about some of the things he was afforded. No handcuffs, of course, the president wearing his signature suit and tie. And I will mention, too, by the way, that we are expecting in the next couple of minutes to hear from Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg. But, you know, you mentioned the president's legal team and how vast it is. He has his own specific team here in Atlanta that is very much watching closely what happens today, because keep in mind the president is potentially facing another indictment, potentially here out of Fulton County, having to do with alleged election meddling, that famous call to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger. So let's talk about that while we wait for Alvin Bragg to come to the podium here. and make some remarks on what happened today. You know, the Fulton County case, obviously, it's a different case altogether. It's a different beast. We know that the charges would vastly be different, but also a lot of people that I've talked to, and I want your take on this too, Josh, is have said, you know, the severity of what he could face here in Fulton County could vastly trump, for lack of a better term, what he's facing in New York. This all has to do in New York and Manhattan with business expenses, personal conduct. What we're talking about here in Fulton County is very different and like I said, potentially, and I want your opinion on it, more severe.
Absolutely. The 34 felonies that Donald Trump is facing in New York, they grade their felonies differently than we do here in Georgia. You'll hear these class A, B, C, D. We don't do that in Georgia like that. We have misdemeanors and we have felonies, and the felonies punishments are specifically written into the code. And that code section instructs a judge how to sentence upon conviction of a specific charge.
Yeah, and hey, Josh, just to interrupt you real quick, we're getting word that former President Trump is actually leaving the courtroom now, and so we'll show you that as his motorcade pulls away. The black SUV is leaving, driving through the streets of downtown Manhattan. Again, I mean, it's a jarring image because when you see this motorcade, you're so used to seeing it, you know, in sort of a celebratory moment, right? It's always exciting to see the motorcade, see the president, hear the lights, see the lights. But of course, this is very sombering today. I mean, even the president, when he walked into the courtroom earlier today, certainly did not look as bombastic as he usually does. He is not one to shy away from cameras. He's not one to shy away from media. But I mean, he looked very somber walking out of that courtroom today, walking into that courtroom today.
There is a certain august presence and decorum and respect due the office of the president, regardless of politics, regardless of demeanor, regardless of the time. This is the supreme commander of the really the most important nation in the world. And
Right.
I don't say that flippantly. We have the most dominant position worldwide, and this is a former leader being formally accused of crimes.
Right. And listen, Josh, we always do, your analysis on this and for being with us today. Really quickly, just want to let everyone know that as we watch the former president leave that Manhattan courtroom, he is going to be back in Florida at his home in Mar-a-Lago tonight for a rally. So, of course, we're going to continue to cover that for you as well, too. We expect him to be back to his normal self. About 500 people invited to that rally at Mar-a-Lago. For now, though, we're going to end our streaming coverage on Atlanta News First Plus, and we're going to turn it over to CBS for this special report.
On what happens in the future when we deal with the 2024 elections, the fact that he may have signed these checks while he was president of the United States does create a very interesting wrinkle.
What does it create a new legal wrinkle?
Well, it doesn't create necessarily a new legal wrinkle, but it certainly might give fuel to the fire if someone is looking at a future of saying, well, we can't have him be president, and how do you wind up getting rid of someone who might become president? You have to impeach them. So private conduct doesn't really get us to that level, but conduct while you were president of the United States just might. But that's so far in the future that it takes us away from the present day.
I've been texting with advisors and associates of Trump, asking if they're surprised Trump didn't speak to reporters outside the courtroom, and they said no. They said Trump is a Florida resident now, in every sense, politically, culturally. He doesn't like what New York has become for him, the experience of him being in New York, a fortified Trump Tower. He can't go to the 21 Club down the street anymore and have a bite to eat and be greeted by people in the streets. It's a different New York for Donald Trump, and he was given a bracing reminder of that today in Lower Manhattan.
In fact, even when it's hot in the summer in Florida, Trump does not come back. He goes out to Bedford, New Jersey.
Bedminster, New Jersey.
Bedminster, New Jersey, different place than Bedford, New York, and spends his summers out there.
He's going back to his plane, the Boeing 757 now, often parked at LaGuardia Airport. That has long been the place he flies in and out of. This campaign plane was shuttered for a long time, but it has been now put back on the campaign trail for Trump. He's been using it at recent rallies. He'll be flying back to Florida in that aircraft before he goes on to Mar-a-Lago.
And I wonder, as they drive up Manhattan and through the city, if he's reminiscing a little bit. A lot of the buildings that he is passing, used to have his name on them. And now those names have been taken down. So the city has changed a lot since he became president in terms of how it relates to Donald Trump.
We've noted that Trump first faced criminal investigations in the 1970s. He has avoided criminal charges up until today as a former president of the United States. But while under investigation and while challenged throughout his life, Trump has used two main tactics: attack and delay. He has been on the attack since this morning. His sons are on the attack as they are personally going after the district attorney and the judge in this case. There will not be a gag order, we believe, in this case. It would be difficult to enforce, as Ricky Kleeman has noted. How does this play out?
And who joins the attack? If you are, there's the 2024 candidates, but anybody engaged in public life, because this is an attack on the judicial system. You attack it for the purposes of undermining whatever finally happens to the president. So who chooses to join in that attack? And there's a cost to doing so, because you're basically saying this is an illegitimate proceeding. That's a very dangerous thing to say.
And on the legal side, delay, 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 which is always the defense point of view. The prosecutor wants to go forward quickly as possible. They want to get this done. And the defense always wants to delay, because delay always benefits every criminal defendant.
You think back to Michael Cohen is at the center of this case, but when I was watching those images come in of Donald Trump sitting there in the courtroom, I was thinking not of Michael Cohen, but of Roy Cohn, Trump's longtime advisor, now passed, but someone who was of New York, of the legal community, highly controversial for his ethical decisions over the course of his career. I was thinking about Roger Stone. I mean, there was a combative advisor and lawyer almost always at Trump's side. He had a few of them today, but it's an entirely different context, a different stage of his life, running again for the presidency. And he's not now the man on page 6. He's a former president of the United States of America, coming back to Manhattan.
And now launching another bid for the presidency, which you have noted will largely become part of his grievance campaign, as he will use that as a means to run for president.
And who's watching this? Who's watching this in the Republican Party? Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, Governor Youngkin, maybe a rising member of the United States Senate, and wonder, is this a moment of political vulnerability, not just legal vulnerability?
And what do you think?
My reporting shows that every Republican who's ambitious is watching this and waiting. And they're waiting to see if the hammer ever drops from that mute figure in American life who has a lot of influence, Jack Smith, the special counsel. If that ever comes down on conspiracy to obstruct, conspiracy to try to overturn an election, those types of federal crimes, Republican strategists tell us behind the scenes, could be the opening, not New York, not Stormy Daniels, at least at this time.
The indictment against Donald Trump has been unsealed, but it has still not been made public. We have had a reporter inside that courtroom. We are going to hear from him shortly. The indictment, what we do know is that the indictment said there was a scheme to pay people off that began in 2015, and Trump himself saying loudly, not guilty. We're also told that he answered a few other questions. More details just coming in. We will bring them to you as we know them. Let's talk about what's next for Donald Trump. He speaks tonight at Mar-a-Lago. What will the effect be of that? What does the former president hope to achieve? What do his political advisors say they want to happen?
Behind the scenes, we're told that Trump is actively making fun of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis because he's watching all this tape come in of DeSantis on the campaign trail. DeSantis hasn't announced anything, but moving closer to a bid. And Trump is telling his advisors, they're scared of me. They don't want to take me on. So what we expect to see in the speech tonight is for Trump to cast Alvin Bragg, the district attorney, in a negative light, but also be defiant and express confidence about his own presidential bid.
And there we are watching the motorcade of Donald Trump make its way up, which looks like the FDR, on their way back to LaGuardia, where he will fly. We just have the indictment being handed to us. Let's bring in Scott McFarland. Scott.
I'm joined here by Graham Cates, who was in the courtroom. I was in the overflow courtroom. You mentioned that Donald Trump spoke 6 times. What were the other 5 things he said besides not guilty?
That's correct. The judge ran through with him some of his rights. He has a right to a different attorney if he wants to. He also can waive his ability to appear at different hearings, either voluntarily, depending on some factors, or if the judge is unhappy with his behavior, essentially. And each time the judge gave one of these instructions, he asked former President Trump, "Do you understand?" And Trump said, "Yes," or "I do," "Yes," or "I do." And this happened 5 times. And then the other time he spoke was when he said, "Not guilty."
What's important to underscore here is that there was no gag order issued in this case. There were a lot of pieces of speculation that they may order the parties to be gagged on this because there's been such fiery rhetoric coming from the former president. No reference to a gag order, no proposed gag order?
That's correct. What they're working out right now, though, is a deal about discovery where they're going to limit how much he and the defense team and the district attorney can talk about the things that are produced by the prosecutors to the defense team. There was some discussion of maybe only meeting in one room with the defense team and him not being allowed to take materials out of that room and him being barred from sharing it with anyone, including the press.
What the court clerk said as she read this charge was 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree. Later in the proceedings, there was also a reference from the state, from the district attorney, to a scheme.
That's right. They said that their investigation dates back to materials that go as far back as 2015, where they described former President Trump and a former lawyer who we know to be Michael Cohen discussing the ability to pay off people so that material that might hurt his presidential campaign wouldn't make it into the fold.
I would say this, Nora. This is such a humble building compared to the other courthouses across America, the federal courthouses, the Supreme Court. Kind of small, a little stuffy, a bit of a dank room. I noticed the former president smiled slightly when the press photographers were in the room for a few moments. Otherwise, kind of hunched over in his chair, somewhat expressionless, nothing in his hands, no pen, no paper, no note-taking. And it was his defense attorney, Tom Blanche, the newly hired defense attorney, who spoke for him.
That's correct. Todd Blanche. So he was very serious. Donald Trump was very serious. He didn't make a lot of gestures. He whispered with his attorneys a little bit. But Blanche kind of said, we need to see this indictment. Now that it's finally unsealed, we need to study it and then figure out what our next steps are. Nora.
Graham, I'm just looking at a press release from the Manhattan District Attorney's Office that is a statement of fact that the defendant, Donald J. Trump, repeatedly and fraudulently falsified New York business records to conceal criminal conduct that hid damaging information from the voting public during the 2016 presidential election. I want to walk through this with you. They first note that in one instance, American Media, Inc., AMI, which is the holding company for the National Enquirer, paid $30,000 to a former Trump Tower doorman who claimed to have a story about a child Trump had out of wedlock. How does that factor into this?
You know, in court, they didn't describe one by one what the different allegations were, other than to lay out this timeline that I think went back further than we expected. And that's actually the first time hearing about it. So I think we're going to see that there are other materials. We've known so much that has come from people like Michael Cohen and others who are kind of in this orbit. But now with these investigators who have been looking into this since actually about 2018 are finally revealing to us what they've learned in all that time.
And Graham, correct, there was no gag order issued by the judge, but there was a warning about social media posts.
That's correct. You know, he asked both the defense attorneys and the prosecutors to talk to the defendant, former President Donald Trump, and their witnesses about making any comments that he said could incite violence or unrest. I mean, he gave a few different instructions along those lines, saying you should really tell your client not to make social media posts that might incite violence, not to say things that might incite violence. And this was after the prosecutors handed him a list of social media posts, they said, that they believed made this area around the courthouse one that needed even more securing than it would have been normally if a former president was coming around.
What's more, this is the first, but it also might be the last proceeding in which the media is blocked. The permission to use cameras, the permission to use laptops or phones inside the courtroom. The judge said he'd consider opening it up for future proceedings. So this might be a one-of-a-kind moment where everything's happening behind closed doors and a closed curtain.
Graham, I want to also continue to read from this press release from the Manhattan District Attorney's Office about this concealing criminal conduct from the public during the 26th presidential election. The first instance that I mentioned, according to this press release, that AMI paid $30,000 to a former Trump Tower doorman who said they had information about a child that Trump had out of wedlock. In a second instance, according to the press release, AMI paid $150,000 to a woman who alleged she had a sexual relationship with Trump. And when Trump explicitly directed a lawyer who then worked for the Trump organization to reimburse AMI in cash, the special counsel indicated to Trump that the payment should be made via a shell company and not by cash. What does this tell us in terms of what you heard in that courtroom?
That was really important. You know, it's not about the payments themselves. It's about the falsification of business records. So the attempt to cover up, allegedly, who the payment came from and who the payment was to. And again, they stress that this was, according to them, done so that it would make his campaign one that where this wasn't causing stumbles and it wasn't becoming a bigger issue for him, all these different instances.
Let's bring in former Manhattan District Attorney Cy Vance, who first opened the investigation into former President Donald Trump in 2018, but left office before those charges were filed. This is his first interview since the indictment has been unsealed. Mr. Vance, thank you for joining us. First, since you have knowledge of much of the information against Donald Trump, your reaction to these 34 felony counts?
Well, first, Nora, my reaction is to the proceedings themselves. I think your excellent panel has all talked about the sobering nature of the proceeding. And I think, first of all, we should all take heart in the fact that the proceedings went off in an organized, calm and deliberative manner. I think many thought that when this arraignment would take place, it would precipitate violence outside the courtroom or near the district attorney's office. And at least as of this point, that has not happened. And that is good. I think it is a harbinger of how Judge Merchan is going to want to run this case. He's going to want to keep it on a tight schedule. He's going to want to control the conduct of the party so that they do not have this proceeding go off track. And I think, as should be the case, I have hope that this will proceed in a way where the public will find out the relevant information at the trial and a judgment will be rendered at the appropriate time by a Manhattan jury.
Do you think that Donald Trump will be found guilty?
I don't have the evidence. I've gone through the indictment very quickly, and so that would be premature, and I think inappropriate for me to answer that question, not knowing so many of the facts that are particularly known by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. I will say that they've spent a lot of time on this, and I think they have obviously believed that they put together a solid case, or they wouldn't have brought it. But the actual merits in a case like this go through a lot of checkpoints where facts need to be proved, theories need to be tested, and your excellent panelists have discussed many of those factors that are going to unfold in the coming months.
Mr. Vance, I know that you originally greenlit this investigation. You brought on Mark Pomerantz, who's written a book about this, but ultimately you left office before any charges were brought, an indictment, and it took Alvin Bragg to move this forward. What happened in that time? Why was Alvin Bragg able to bring an indictment that you were not? What pieces of the investigative puzzle were added, do you believe?
Well, first of all, Nora, I think there's a slightly more nuanced background. We did indict in the summer of 2021 the Trump Organization in 17 counts for a broad tax fraud conspiracy, along with its chief financial officer, Alan Weisselberg. We first started down this road in probably 2017 neighborhood, and we're investigating when the federal government commenced its investigation into the hush money payments, and that the office asked our office to stand down on our investigation. And I said yes. I thought it was appropriate out of my respect for the U.S. Attorney's Office and their experience. But I was surprised when, after Michael Cohen pled guilty, that the case seemed to have been dropped by the federal government. We had turned our attention onto financial investigations of the Trump Organization and former president. I can say that without breaching confidence because I was sued by the president and the office. And in that lawsuit in federal court, he attached a copy of our grand jury subpoena, which typically is something that cannot be revealed unless you're the person receiving it. So for the next period of time, we were investigating financial matters as outlined in the grand jury subpoena. But what happened, of course, Nora, is COVID. And COVID was obviously very impactful on our ability to get a grand jury, to compel evidence, to compel production of documents. And we and New York City and all over the country, we were really unable to move in using the traditional investigative techniques during that long time period. But we continued to press ahead, and actually in that time period, that other year and a half, went to the Supreme Court twice, through 2 district courts, through 2 separate panels of courts of appeal, and a full hearing before the Supreme Court. And ultimately, the Supreme Court issued its ruling, first, that no man, former president, was against being investigated, and secondly, that Mr. Trump and the organization had to produce this document. So when you say we didn't move forward, I just want to be clear that there was a lot of work done that leads up to this day in earlier chapters. But in truth, in the summer of 2021, as my term was expiring, we did not have the time to complete the investigation, the broader financial investigation that was underway. And ultimately, whatever decisions I made about going forward or not, I understood it was going to be the new district attorney's decision on what to focus on. And you see, since he came in office, this has been his focus.
And Mr. Vance, thank you very much for that clarification. It was your work that ultimately led the Supreme Court to deny Trump's final bid to block his tax returns that were ultimately turned over in what was a huge case that we covered, certainly from Washington when the Supreme Court made that. So thank you for pointing that out, the work of your office and the prosecutors there. I want to ask you about the legal theory behind the current district attorney's case, which is essentially elevating these misdemeanors to a felony charge by linking them to a campaign finance violation. Is that a difficult case to prove?
Well, I think my experience, as you have very ably, you and John have very ably explained with your panelists, a false business records charge is not new to the district attorney's office. It's sort of the equivalent of a conspiracy charge in federal court. So those are charged all the time. During my tenure, we did elevate a misdemeanor false business record charge to a felony when it pertained to other crimes that were intended for the creation of the false business record, including some federal crimes. But what was not done during our office was to elevate it for purposes of proving that the false business record was designed to violate federal election laws. That's something that was not done by my office. I'm not sure it has done by the office. That does not mean it is legally deficient, but I think, as others have said, this will be one of the early test points that the defense will bring, presumably an early motion to dismiss, to take on that theory and to ask the court to rule that these counts cannot be elevated and therefore should remain as misdemeanors. Now, as Jerry Goldfeder said, the objects of the false business records in some instances may be violations of state election law. That's going to be, again, another focused effort by the defense to figure what happened there. At the end of the day, Judge Merchan is going to, I think, early on, or within a reasonable period of time, issue legal rulings on these fundamental preliminary law issues, and I think that's where we'll see the first efforts of the defense.
Thank you, Mr. Vance. And John Dickerson is here as well.
My question, Mr. Vance, hi, is in what we have before us, it talks about how the defendant, Donald J. Trump, orchestrated a scheme from August 2015 to December 2017. And before we've had this information, we've mostly been talking about the hush money payments to Stormy Daniels. What appears to be the case here, and my question to you is this a narrative technique or is this a legal argument, which is essentially, it seems to be arguing that Donald Trump started a conspiracy in 2015 that was this entire catch and kill, and that the entire catch and kill idea was a campaign violation, that it was orchestrated from its... Yeah, go ahead.
I apologize for interrupting you. I obviously haven't had time, nor have you, to scrutinize the indictment. In my quick pass-through, I didn't see a conspiracy count. Maybe there is one. And if there is, please tell me. But you're talking about essentially sort of what we call a speaking indictment, which is an indictment that provides just more than bare-bone facts, but that also provides some explanation of the underlying conduct, which is used as a public document to explain to the public the underlying bases for the charges. What I principally saw was false business record counts. And it looks like there are several different time periods involving different people where it was done, one with the doorman, one perhaps with Karen McDougal, and another one with Stormy Daniels. That's what I see as the gravamen of the charges. But it is a story, and it's just cases are tried as stories. And I think the story that will be put forth here is a multiple-year conspiracy to violate state and election laws by manipulating the internal books, ledgers, checks of the company.
Michael Cohen's potential testimony, how would it factor into this case in the coming months?
Mr. Cohen obviously is going to be attacked very heavily by the defense. They will paint him as a liar and unbelievable. But as I've said before, and as someone who has tried many, many, many cases with individuals who have criminal records as principal witnesses for the prosecution, you take your witnesses where you find them. And the question really will be, what is the quality of the corroborative evidence outside of Michael Cohen's say-so that a jury can rely upon to believe Michael Cohen when he says something happened? So the quality of the corroborative evidence will be key. Now, if we have false ledgers and checks and the like, and Mr. Cohen can tie those tightly with his behavior, that will in some sense bolster Mr. Cohen's credibility, even though it will be heavily attacked. And finally and foremost, he worked for Donald Trump. And so while one can say whatever you want to say, there was a proximity between himself and Mr. Trump and a closeness, which I think will be a factor the jury will consider as it looks at Mr. Trump's credibility. Excuse me, Mr. Cohen's credibility.
Former Manhattan District Attorney Cyrus Vance Jr. Mr. Vance, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And we want to show you what is a shot of a press conference where we are expected to hear from the current Manhattan District Attorney, Alvin Bragg, who will speak shortly about this historic indictment. Want to bring back in Scott McFarlane and Graham Cates. And I understand dates were decided on for the next hearings and even a trial. What can you tell us?
Yeah, Nora, the next court date, the next court proceeding scheduled in this criminal case is for December 2023 with a tentative trial date of January 2024. But to put it charitably and mildly, all of that is subject to change. Everything remarkably fluid at this stage. But I also want to bring in Graham for this. There was a reference during the proceedings to that social media post Trump made showing himself with a bat and the district attorney Alvin Bragg. Why did that come up?
The prosecutors put forward to the judge a set of documents that they said was a printout of several social media posts that former President Trump had made. They specifically highlighted the one with the baseball bat. And then they said that they were seriously concerned about public statements threatening our office, the court, and the city of New York. And they said that some of the statements directly addressed the grand jury and intimidated witnesses. And they asked the judge to address that. Now, Trump's attorney, Todd Blanche, said it is true that Trump was responding forcefully, he said, but he said this was because witnesses who had spoken out about appearing before the grand jury, and even he said the DA's own leaks, which they kept referring to, had pushed Trump into a place where he felt he had to respond aggressively. Now, I want to point out that on this, the judge, Juan Marchand, actually did speak about this, and he said it didn't look like to him like this was just responding to that, but that he thought that some of this rhetoric was too much. But he said he wasn't issuing a gag order at this point anyway.
And I'll note, no gag order issued, which means that will not impact the former president's expected remarks tonight in Florida.
There was one thing about the gag order, which is that the judge said one of the reasons he's not doing it is because this is a presidential candidate and he's aware of the First Amendment considerations in attempting to limit the speech of someone who is running for president.
Nora?
From Graham Cates and Scott McFarland, who witnessed this historic hearing today, thank you. Also want to recap that Donald Trump pleading not guilty to 34 counts against him of falsifying business records in order to conceal other conduct. That's why they were felony charges. From a press release from the Manhattan DA, we learned about 3 particular instances that they have zeroed in on. That AMI, which is the parent company for National Enquirer, paid $30,000 to a former Trump Tower doorman who claimed to have a story about a child that Trump had out of wedlock. In a second instance, AMI paying $150,000 to a woman who alleged that she had a sexual relationship with Trump, and that then the special counsel was asked to make a payment via a shell company and not cash. And then in a third instance, 12 days before the presidential general election, the special counsel wired $130,000 to an attorney for an adult film actress. That is the Michael Cohen and Stormy Daniels case that has been discussed ad nauseum by many about what is the heart of this case. But there were others as well that have been mentioned today. Ricky, you've had a chance to look through this indictment. What stood out to you?
Well, we have to look at the indictment, and the indictment doesn't tell us much more than what the charges are. But the district attorney, Alvin Bragg, has filed a statement of facts. And it's the statement of facts, which is 13 pages, that really is, in essence, the talking indictment. It becomes a substitute. And what we learned, or at least what I learned in my quick read, is that the story that has to do with Stormy Daniels, the story that has to do with Karen McDougal, 2 women who had sexual relationships with Donald Trump, a story involving a woman and a doorman about her story. None of this is new for those of us who have followed Donald Trump's activities. But what we learn out of this is one witness, obviously, Michael Cohen. Second witness, clearly David Pecker, the head of American Media, the national.
All right, everybody, we're jumping out of our special coverage now from CBS to get you over to what is about to be the Manhattan DA speaking out on the recent Trump arraignment. I'm going to get into some of those details with you here of what we've learned. Now, we know the former president has pled not guilty to 34 counts of first-degree falsifying documents. Now, we are going to get some of those details, hopefully, from the Manhattan DA, Alvin Bragg, here in a moment. This press conference was supposed to start at 3:30. It is now 4:01 p.m. So really any moment now we could see the Manhattan DA come on and talk a little bit about what today entailed, the arraignment, the arrest of the former president, really a historic event for U.S. history. Today, Donald Trump becoming the first former president to be arraigned for these charges. And now what the future holds. So a lot of those details are going to come out in this press conference. We appreciate all of those who have stuck with us here since we first joined with you at 1 o'clock, I believe. But right now we're really going to get the details into what took place in that criminal courthouse, that courtroom where the former president was arraigned. He was read the charges. He entered his plea of not guilty, and now a lot of those details that are still not known are going to hopefully come out in this press conference. I do expect the DA may field questions, at which point you'll hear some of these reporters asking the big unknowns. What exactly took place inside this courtroom? You know, there weren't cameras or live video that was allowed inside. We did get a few still photos, but the main thing that we got, and I'm going to play this video for you here, is seeing Donald Trump, you know, exit the courthouse briefly following his booking and formal arrest, and then heading into his the courtroom for arraignment, and that arraignment took place. Now, at this very moment, we did just hear that the motorcade has pulled up to the airport. The Trump plane is on the ground on the tarmac. I do believe they have not boarded yet. They may have boarded just a moment ago, but from what I can see, those cars just pulling up, and let me see if I can get you guys this live shot. The Trump plane ready to go, flying back to Mar-a-Lago in Florida. Speaking of Florida, hey, if you're going to stick with us on this as we take you through all of the major updates, you should know at 8:30 p.m. Eastern, we are told that the former president is expected to deliver remarks from Florida, from his Mar-a-Lago estate. Now, those remarks could very likely be about his arraignment today. We don't really know the details, but we do know he's going to be speaking out, so you can count on us to bring you that live coverage. But I want to take you out to this plane here so you can see what I'm looking at right there from our sister station, showing you the Trump plane in New York, a motorcade surrounding it. This is where the former president is going to be taking off from on his way back to Florida. He landed here just yesterday, got arrested, got booked, did the procedural steps, got arraigned, and now he heads back to Florida. All the while, we're waiting for Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg to come out and share with us really the details of what took place today. So I got a double box for you here. On your left, our sister station, WABC, showing you that Trump plane. This is as close as we could possibly get to it. And then on your right-hand side, a live picture of this press conference that really is going to take place any moment now. So we're going to continue to follow the updates and take you through the latest of what we know. But speaking of some background, I want to fill you in on, if you weren't with us at the start of this stream that we came on with you at 1 o'clock here on Atlanta News First Plus, I want to talk about how historic this arraignment was, and really all of today involving former President Donald Trump becoming the first ex-president in history to face criminal charges. And we're not talking about just a couple, we're talking about 34 counts of falsifying business records in the first degree, becoming the nation's first ex-president, again, to face these types of criminal charges. Now, Donald Trump surrendered himself, of course, to the Manhattan courthouse. We saw that take place. He was then brought through the process, formally arrested, read his charges. He faced arraignment, at which point we learned that he did face the 34 counts of falsifying business records, to which he pled not guilty. And this all stemming from last week when the district attorney, Alvin Bragg, Manhattan DA, indicted, well, I should say the New York grand jury indicted former President Donald Trump, but DA Bragg bringing down that indictment leading up to today, this moment, the arraignment, the arrest, and really what has so many people across the nation watching is what is going to be the response from DA Bragg, who we'll hear from in a moment, we're told. And then later tonight, what is former President Donald Trump going to say after a day of being arrested in New York, being booked, and having his arraignment in a Manhattan courthouse, facing those criminal charges, and what the next steps are from him? I mean, we take you to a statement that he posted to Truth Social just earlier today. I'm going to pull this up for you, saying, heading to Lower Manhattan, the courthouse, seems so unreal. wow, they are going to arrest me. Can't believe this is happening in America. And then he follows it up with make America great again. That statement directly from the former president, essentially saying that he is in disbelief himself that this is taking place. And I'm going to bring you through some other reaction that we're getting into the newsroom, particularly some local reaction. Let me just bear with me here as I pull up some statements. One of those you'll see is from Marjorie Taylor Greene, who, as I was mentioning earlier, has been very public about her support for Donald Trump through all this. Her saying, President Trump has been arrested. This is a stain on our republic. May God be with President Trump. That from Georgia Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, who earlier today actually flew out, or made her way, I should say, to New York to be there. We did receive reports that she was going to lead some sort of peaceful protest, but due to safety reasons, she was escorted. And now that brings us to this moment. Alvin Bragg about to detail some of what went on inside the courtroom is what we hope to hear more about, but really this is going to be our shot at getting some answers to the details that remain unknown, where our cameras couldn't go, of course, and a better understanding of the DA's take on all of this. You know, there have been several local officials, national officials that have come out and said, you know, either they're in support of Donald Trump and going after the Manhattan DA, or saying that this is a step in democracy. Again, I'm going to leave this up for you, and any moment now, Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg possibly going to be speaking out on the Trump arraignment from what we can see.
All right, so you are watching live right now as we are waiting for the Manhattan District Attorney, Alvin Bragg, to speak at any moment now on the arraignment of the former president, Donald Trump. Now, the first former or even sitting U.S. president to face criminal charges. And he pleaded not guilty to the 34 counts against him. The indictment citing 34 different counts of falsifying business records. You know, we've been waiting to actually get our hands on the indictment. Finally, we have gotten to take a look at it. It's now been made public. It was first done under seal. The indictment actually coming down under seal last week. That's when we learned that a New York grand jury had indicted the former president. But of course, what we had been waiting to hear is what the official charges were. And then just within the last few hours, we learned that it was 34 counts of falsifying business records. Now, again, all of this is in connection to alleged hush money payments to adult film star Stormy Daniels to cover up an affair. And was done allegedly through Trump's former attorney, Michael Cohen. This is kind of during the 2016 presidential campaign. But I actually got a chance to look at the indictments just a few moments ago, the actual charging documents, and it appears that the payouts, many of them were made in 2017, or rather the falsification, the alleged falsification, I should say, of the business records was in 2017. Very interesting to note. We are waiting, as we wait to hear from the Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, very interesting to note that hush money payouts per se are not illegal in the state of New York. That's not the crime or a crime. And what is being charged here is the falsifying business records, because the, okay, looks like he is up. Sorry, let me, let's take you in here to listen live.
By a Manhattan grand jury on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records in the first degree. Under New York State law, it is a felony to falsify business records with intent to defraud and an intent to conceal another crime. That is exactly what this case is about. 34 false statements made to cover up other crimes. These are felony crimes in New York State, no matter who you are. We cannot and will not normalize serious criminal conduct. The defendant repeatedly made false statements on New York business records. He also caused others to make false statements. The defendant claimed that he was paying Michael Cohen for legal services performed in 2017. This simply was not true. And it was a false statement that the defendant made month after month in 2017. April, May, June, and so on through the rest of the year. For 9 straight months, the defendant held documents in his hand containing this key lie, that he was paying Michael Cohen for legal services performed in 2017. And he personally signed checks for payments to Michael Cohen for each of these 9 months. In total, the grand jury found there were 34 documents with this critical false statement. Why did Donald Trump repeatedly make these false statements? The evidence will show that he did so to cover up crimes relating to the 2016 election. Donald Trump, executives at the publishing company American Media Incorporated, Mr. Cohen, and others agreed in 2015 to a catch and kill scheme. That is, a scheme to buy and suppress negative information to help Mr. Trump's chance of winning the election. As part of this scheme, Donald Trump and others made 3 payments to people who claimed to have negative information about Mr. Trump. To make these payments, they set up shell companies, and they made yet more false statements, including, for example, in AMI, American Media Incorporated's business records. One of the 3 people that they paid to keep quiet was a woman named Stormy Daniels. Less than 2 weeks before the presidential election, Michael Cohen wired $130,000 to Stormy Daniels' lawyer. That payment was to hide damaging information from the voting public. The participant scheme was illegal. The scheme violated New York election law, which makes it a crime to conspire to promote a candidacy by unlawful means. The $130,000 wire payment exceeded the federal campaign contribution cap, and the false statements in AMI's books violated New York law. That is why Mr. Trump made false statements about his payments to Mr. Cohen. He could not simply say that the payments were a reimbursement for Mr. Cohen's payments to Stormy Daniels. To do so, to make that true statement, would have been to admit a crime. So instead, Mr. Trump said that he was paying Mr. Cohen for fictitious legal services in 2017 to cover up actual crime committed the prior year. And in order to get Michael Cohen his money back, They planned one last false statement. In order to complete the scheme, they planned to mischaracterize the repayments to Mr. Cohen as income to the New York State tax authorities. The conduct I just described and that which was charged by the grand jury is felony criminal conduct in New York State. True and accurate business records are important everywhere, to be sure. They are all the more important in Manhattan, the financial center of the world. That is why we have a history in the Manhattan DA's office of vigorously enforcing white-collar crime. My office, including the talented prosecutors you saw at arraignment earlier today, has charged hundreds of felony falsifying business records. This charge, it can be said, is the bread and butter of our white-collar work. And fraud presents itself in all different forms here in Manhattan. We have charged falsifying business records for those who violated federal bank secrecy laws. We have charged falsifying business records for those who were seeking to cover up sex crimes. And we have brought this charge for those who committed tax violations. At its core, this case today is one with allegations like so many of our white-collar cases. Allegations that someone lied again and again to protect their interests and evade the laws to which we are all held accountable. As this office has done time and time again, we today uphold our solemn responsibility to ensure that everyone stands equal before the law. No amount of money and no amount of power changes that enduring American principle. I'll now take questions.
So we're going to take a limited number of questions. There are no follow-up questions. One question per reporter. I will call on you. And again, we have limited time. Thank you. The first question will be Rick.
Thank you. Ricky Russell, CNN. Why now? I mean, some argue that this is a political move. You're not going to be a political person. The Fergie's are going to go into
We conducted a thorough and rigorous investigation, as we're known to do, at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. I've been doing this for 24 years and am no stranger to rigorous, complex investigations. I bring cases when they're ready. Having now conducted a rigorous, thorough investigation, the case was ready to be brought, and it was brought.
Mr. Bragg, the indictment says that there were 34 false business records. And they were done to conceal another crime, but the indictment does not specifically say what those crimes were. We are assuming, perhaps, that they might be election-related. I'm wondering if you can specify what laws were also broken.
All right. So let me say as an initial matter, the indictment doesn't specify that because the law does not so require. In my remarks, I mentioned a couple of laws, which I will highlight again now. The first is New York State election law, which makes it a crime to conspire to promote a candidacy by unlawful means. I further indicated a number of unlawful means, including more additional false statements, including statements that were planned to be made to tax authorities. I also noted the federal election law cap on contribution limits.
But why weren't there those crimes charged? Falsely charged with those crimes?
Well, I'm not going to go into our deliberative process on what was brought. The charges that were brought were the ones that were brought. The evidence in the law is the basis for those decisions.
You had expressed a year ago that you had some reservations about the case's readiness. Can you talk to us about what were some of the questions in your mind that needed to be answered in order to bring a case of this magnitude?
I'm not going to go chapter and verse into any thinking. What I will say is, I believe the time period you're talking about, I've been in office for a couple of months. The investigation, in my view, was not concluded into the conduct in particular that is the basis for the charges today. Since that time, we've had more evidence made available to the office and opportunity to meet with additional witnesses. So, as I said earlier, I've been doing this for 24 years. I don't bring cases prior to a thorough and rigorous investigation. Now, having done so, the case has been brought.
Mr. Bragg, Garrett Hake with NBC News. Your predecessor took a hard look at this case and decided not to charge it. Federal prosecutors took a hard look at this case and decided not to charge it. Do you believe you have new evidence that led you to decide to charge this, or why now?
Well, as I just mentioned, we have had available to the office additional evidence that was not in the office's possession prior to my time here. And as to your part of your question about the federal, we have a distinct and strong, I would say profound, independent interest in New York State. This is the business capital of the world. We regularly do cases involving false business statements. The bedrock, in fact, the basis for business integrity and a well-functioning business marketplace is true and accurate record keeping. That's the charge that's brought here, falsifying New York State business records. I'm not going to go beyond the plain language statement of facts, which I think speaks for itself. So the charge is falsifying business records. The charge requires, as I specified, criminal conduct that was concealed. One of the concealed crimes we allege is New York State election law. I sort of went through in our statement of facts, which I think many of you have in front of you, goes through things including text messages, emails, contemporaneous phone records, multiple witnesses. All of that will be, as you saw in the fall, borne out in a public courtroom in downtown Manhattan.